There is something strange about every major Canadian city, something that sits just below the surface, not in a metaphorical sense, but literally, physically, under the concrete and the glass towers and the highways and the carefully landscaped parks. Something that was there first. Something that, in many cases, was there for a very, very long time before anyone with a European name ever drew a line on a map and called it a settlement. We talk about Canadian history like it begins around 1534, when Jacques Cartier sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and decided he had discovered something. Or maybe 1608, when Samuel de Champlain drove wooden stakes into the ground at the base of a great cliff and called it Quebec. Or 1642, when a group of religious colonists landed on an island in the middle of a massive river and began building what would become Montreal. We talk about John Graves Simcoe choosing the site of Toronto. We talk about the fur traders who pushed west and eventually planted the seeds of cities like Winnipeg and Edmonton and Vancouver. But that version of the story has a problem, a serious problem, because every single one of those locations, every site where a European arrived and decided to build, was already known, already used, already inhabited, already layered with meaning and memory and history that stretched back not decades, not centuries, but in many cases, thousands of years. The question that keeps historians and archaeologists up at night is not simply who was there first. We know who was there first. Indigenous peoples have been in North America for at least 15,000 years, and some evidence suggests considerably longer. The question that makes this story genuinely strange, genuinely unsettling, genuinely mysterious, is this: why those specific places? Why did Europeans, arriving on a coastline they had never seen, speaking languages no one in this land had ever heard, consistently plant their cities in the exact same spots that had already been centers of indigenous life for millennia? The easy answer is geography. Rivers, harbors, defendable high ground, access to food, proximity to trade routes, these things are universal. Any intelligent people will recognize a good location. But the easy answer starts to break down when you look at the details. When you realize that some of those locations were not just convenient stopping points, but were active, complex, populated places when Europeans arrived. When you find out that some of the largest pre-Columbian settlements in North America were located precisely where Canadian cities now stand. When you discover that the trade networks, the roads, the cleared lands, the cultivated territories that Europeans used to build their colonies were not empty wilderness at all. They were the remains of something older, something bigger, something we have only barely begun to understand. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? So let's go back. Not to 1534, not to 1608. Let's go back much further than that. Let's go back to a time when the ice was retreating, when the first human footprints were being pressed into the soft mud of a continent, waking up from its long, frozen sleep. And let's follow the thread forward through thousands of years until we arrive. At the moment, a European ship rounded a headland, and the captain looked at the shore and said, "There, that is where we will build." And let's ask, honestly and carefully, what was really already there? The ground beneath Montreal does not begin with the French. It does not begin with Cartier sailing up the river in 1535 and climbing a hill he called Mont Royal, gazing out at the valley below, describing a perfect agricultural landscape with a large fortified town sitting at its center. It does not begin with the Jesuit missionaries and the fur traders and the city that grew up over the next 4 centuries into one of the great metropolises of North America. The ground beneath Montreal begins with a town called Hochelaga. When Jacques Cartier climbed Mont Royal in October of 1535, he was not looking out at empty wilderness. He was standing above a settlement that housed an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 people, surrounded by cornfields that stretched in every direction, protected by a triple palisade of wooden stakes, organized into a sophisticated social and political structure that his European eyes could barely process. He wrote about it in detail in his journal, recording his astonishment at the scale of the place, the organization of the longhouses, the warmth of the reception he received, the obvious prosperity of the community. Hochelaga was not a village. It was a city. By the standards of 16th century Europe, it was not small. 3,000 people was a respectable urban population for the time. Paris was larger, yes, but Paris was exceptional. Many European towns of the period housed fewer people than Hochelaga. And then something happened that remains one of the great mysteries of Canadian history. By the time Samuel de Champlain arrived in the early 1600s, Hochelaga was gone, not abandoned gradually, not slowly depopulated, gone. The fields were overgrown, the palisades had rotted, the longhouses had collapsed, there was no one there. Champlain and his contemporaries found nothing but traces, charcoal in the soil, post holes, fragments of pottery, evidence of a settlement that had simply ceased to exist. Where did 3,000 to 5,000 people go? Nobody knows. This is not a figure of speech or an exaggeration for dramatic effect. Historians and archaeologists genuinely do not know what happened to the people of Hochelaga. They were Iroquoian-speaking, probably related to the Haudenosaunee nations, and yet the Haudenosaunee of the 1600s had no memory of them, or at least no memory they chose to share with European chroniclers. They had simply vanished from the landscape, taking their history with them. Some researchers believe there was a catastrophic war sometime between 1535 and 1600, possibly related to the disruption of trade networks that followed early European contact and the arrival of new diseases. Others think the community dispersed voluntarily, migrating to join other groups as conditions changed. Some have suggested that Hochelaga's people were absorbed into the larger Haudenosaunee Confederacy through adoption, the traditional means by which those nations replenished their populations. A few researchers have pointed to evidence of epidemic disease reaching the interior of the continent even before sustained European contact, spread along trade routes that moved goods and germs alike. But what we know for certain is this. When Champlain chose the island of Montreal as the site for a new French colony in 1611, 2 years before the actual founding of the settlement, he was standing on the ruins of something. When the Société Notre-Dame de Montréal established Ville-Marie in 1642, they built on land that had been inhabited, cultivated, and organized by human beings for at least 1,000 years before they arrived. And the story goes deeper than Hochelaga, because Hochelaga was not the beginning either. Beneath the Iroquoian settlements of the St. Lawrence Valley, archaeologists have found evidence of much earlier occupation. The island of Montreal sits at the confluence of the Ottawa and Street. Lawrence Rivers, two of the great highway systems of pre-Columbian North America. Trade goods moved along these rivers for thousands of years before any European eye ever saw them. Copper from Lake Superior, shells from the Atlantic coast, chert from quarries in Ohio, obsidian from volcanic sources in the Rocky Mountains, all of these things have been found in archaeological sites around and under modern Montreal, evidence of a continental trade network of staggering sophistication. The mountain itself, Mont Royal, the hill that gives the city its name, was not simply a geographical feature. Archaeological work on the mountain and in its surrounding area has revealed evidence of human activity spanning several thousand years. Ceremonial sites, caches of tools, traces of habitation dating back well before the Hochelaga period. This was not just a convenient geographic landmark. This was a place that held meaning for human beings across an enormous span of time. When the British and French were fighting over Montreal in the 18th century, when the city was growing along its riverfront and spreading outward in all directions, when the streets were being named and the churches built and the markets established, underneath all of it, the soil was layered with that older history. Artifacts kept turning up. They still do. Construction projects in Montreal regularly uncover evidence of pre-contact occupation, pottery shards, stone tools, fire pits, animal bones, human remains. The city was built on top of something, and that something was already extraordinary. The story of Toronto is, in some ways, even stranger. The name itself is the first clue. Toronto. There is significant debate about its exact etymology, but the most widely accepted interpretation traces it to the Mohawk language, where a phrase meaning something like, "where there are trees standing in water" refers to a fish weir, a kind of underwater fence constructed to trap fish. The French adapted it, applied it to a portage route, and eventually it became associated with the area we now call the City of Toronto, a city named after an indigenous fish trap. A city whose founding European story usually begins with John Graves Simcoe choosing it as the capital of Upper Canada in 1793, deciding it was a defensible harbour, a good place to build a city from scratch. From scratch. That phrase is worth examining, because at the same time Simcoe was surveying the harbour and laying out the grid that would become the streets of York, later renamed Toronto, there was an active indigenous trading post in the area called the Toronto Carrying Place. This was not a casual footpath. This was one of the major trade routes in pre-contact North America, a portage connecting Lake Ontario to Lake Simcoe and beyond, providing access to the upper Great Lakes without having to navigate around the Niagara Peninsula. Indigenous peoples had been using this route for at least 1,000 years, probably longer. The French knew about it. Fort Rouillé, also called Fort Toronto, was established by the French in 1750 on the north shore of Lake Ontario, near the mouth of the Humber River, precisely because it sat at the southern end of this ancient trade corridor. They built it to intercept the fur trade that moved along that route, to redirect Indigenous traders away from the British posts on Lake Ontario. The fort was abandoned and burned by the French themselves in 1759, as the 7 Years' War turned against them. So when Simcoe arrived in 1793 and began building York, he was not starting from nothing. He was building on the site of a burned French fort that had been built at the terminus of an ancient Indigenous trade route that had been in continuous use for a millennium. But even that is not the beginning. Archaeological work around the Toronto area has revealed evidence of human habitation stretching back thousands of years. The Meadowcliff site on the Scarborough Bluffs east of the city centre contains evidence of human occupation dating to approximately 9,000 years ago. Artifacts from that period have been found in the eroding cliff face. Stone tools from people who lived along the shores of Lake Iroquois, the massive post-glacial lake that preceded modern Lake Ontario and sat considerably higher than today's lake level, 9,000 years ago. The city of Toronto is usually said to have been founded in 1793. The gap between those two dates, 9,000 years of human presence on the same piece of ground, is almost incomprehensible. And between 9,000 years ago and 1,793, the Toronto area was not empty. Far from it. The Toronto carrying place was a nexus of Indigenous activity for a very long time. Huron-Wendat people had villages in the area. Seneca people established communities near the Humber River. Archaeological sites around the Don River Valley have yielded evidence of habitation across multiple cultural periods. There is a site called the Te Iagon village, a Seneca settlement established in the 1660s near the mouth of the Humber River, which sat almost exactly where Simcoe would later choose to locate his new capital. The Seneca people who lived there were part of the same vast Haudenosaunee confederacy, whose political and territorial reach extended across an enormous portion of northeastern North America. They were not random inhabitants. They were sophisticated political actors managing a critical node in the trade network of the entire Great Lakes region. When the French built Fort Rouillé a few decades later, they built it near the same spot. When the British chose the same location for their new capital, they were making the same calculation that Indigenous people had been making for thousands of years. The geography was excellent. The harbour was protected. The river provided fresh water and a route inland. The carrying place provided access to the upper lakes. Good geography is good geography. But the persistence of that choice, across thousands of years, across multiple cultural traditions, across the enormous rupture of European contact, says something important about what kind of place this was. It was already a centre. It was already important. The city of Toronto was not built in an empty place. It was built in a place that was already, in every meaningful sense, a crossroads. Quebec City is the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in Canada, founded in 1608, when Samuel de Champlain drove his stakes into the narrow strip of land at the base of Cap Diamant and began constructing his habitation. The cliff above him, and the promontory where the Chateau Frontenac now sits, would later become the fortified heart of French North America, the Gibraltar of the North, the city that controlled the throat of the St. Lawrence. But Champlain did not choose this spot arbitrarily. He chose it because the people he was trading with told him it was important, because his Indigenous guides and trading partners led him there, because the place already had a name in the Algonquin language, Quebec, meaning where the river narrows, a name that reflected an understanding of the strategic geography that local peoples had possessed for a very long time. The narrowing of the St. Lawrence at Quebec City is significant. It is the point where the river becomes narrow enough to control, to monitor, to tax. Anyone who wanted to move goods upriver had to pass through Quebec. Anyone coming down from the interior had to pass through Quebec. It was a choke point, a toll booth, a strategic node in the transportation network of the continent. Indigenous peoples had understood this for centuries before Champlain arrived. The site was used as a trading location, a meeting place, a point where different nations and groups could conduct exchanges. When Cartier had visited in 1535, Just a few miles upriver at Stadacona, he had found another large Iroquoian settlement, similar in character to Hochelaga, similarly prosperous, similarly organized, similarly mysterious in its subsequent disappearance before Champlain's arrival 70 years later. The archaeology of the Quebec City area is dense with pre-contact material. The promontory itself, the high rock where the fortifications were eventually built, shows evidence of indigenous use extending back several thousand years. The riverbank below has yielded artifacts from multiple cultural periods. The area was not merely visited occasionally. It was a significant place in the pre-contact landscape of the St. Lawrence Valley. There is something else about Quebec City that deserves attention. The cliff, Cap Diamant. This enormous rock face rising above the river is not just a convenient defensive position. It is a geological feature of remarkable visual drama, a place that would have been significant in indigenous cosmology and spiritual geography, regardless of its military utility. High places, dramatic natural formations, points where water and land meet in powerful ways, these were consistently important in the spiritual geography of the peoples who inhabited North America before European contact. The fort that Champlain built at the base of the cliff, the upper town that eventually grew on the heights above, the whole layered urban structure of Quebec City, it sits on ground that was already layered with meaning before a single stone was cut or a single French word was spoken there. If Montreal sits at the confluence of rivers and Quebec City sits at the narrowing, then what about Ottawa? Ottawa is the capital of Canada, a status it acquired in 1857 when Queen Victoria chose it over the more obvious candidates of Toronto, Quebec City, Kingston, and Montreal, largely because its position on the border between Canada West and Canada East made it politically neutral, and because its distance from the American border made it slightly less vulnerable to the raids that had troubled the other cities during the War of 1812. The official narrative of Ottawa begins with Philemon Wright, an American-born entrepreneur who crossed the Ottawa River in 1800 and established a logging settlement on the north bank he called Hull. On the south bank, the area that would become Ottawa was developed following the construction of the Rideau Canal, begun in 1826, under the supervision of Lieutenant Colonel John By of the Royal Engineers, who established a construction camp and supply depot that grew into the town of Bytown, later renamed Ottawa. Canals, logging, British military engineers. That is the story usually told about Ottawa. But the Ottawa River is one of the great highways of pre-contact North America. The Kichissippi, the Algonquin name for the river, means Great River, and it earned that name. For thousands of years, the Ottawa River was the main western trade and travel route connecting the Strait, Lawrence Valley to the upper Great Lakes, and the far interior. Everything came through this river. Copper from Lake Superior, furs from the north, corn from the agricultural south, trade goods from as far away as the Gulf Coast. The Algonquin people, the Anishinaabe peoples whose territories encompassed the Ottawa River Valley and the surrounding lands, had been living in this landscape for thousands of years. The specific area at the confluence of the Ottawa and Rideau rivers, where the canal was built, where Bytown grew, was a significant location in Algonquin territorial geography. Rideau Falls, just downstream from the city centre, was a well-known landmark and gathering place. Archaeological work in the Ottawa area has found evidence of human habitation dating back at least 8,000 years. The region around the confluence of the Ottawa and Rideau rivers, the heart of the modern capital, shows evidence of recurring occupation across a very long period. When Lieutenant Colonel By arrived in 1826 to begin his canal construction, he was not beginning history. He was inserting a massive engineering project into a landscape that had been humanly organized and inhabited for 8,000 years. The Rideau Canal itself, one of the great engineering achievements of early 19th century Canada, follows a route along rivers and lakes that had been used as a travel corridor by indigenous peoples for millennia. The canal locks that tourists photograph today, the stone chambers that lower and raise boats through the landscape, they were built along a water route that Algonquin and Haudenosaunee travelers had paddled for thousands of years before any British military engineer ever arrived. Canada built its capital in a place that was already the crossroads of an ancient geography. The Parliament buildings sit on a bluff above the Ottawa River, a position that gives them dramatic visual impact and symbolic weight. That same position, overlooking the Great River, would have held significance for the peoples who lived in this landscape for thousands of years before the British arrived. The ground under Parliament Hill is not simply rock and clay. It is, like everything else in this story, already layered. Now, let's go west. Let's follow the trade routes that indigenous peoples had been traveling for thousands of years before a single European ship appeared on the Pacific coast, before the fur traders of the Northwest Company pushed their canoes through the mountain passes, before anyone in Europe had any idea what lay between the Great Lakes and the Pacific Ocean. Let's talk about Winnipeg. Winnipeg sits at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers in the flat, enormous landscape of the Canadian prairies. The modern city grew from a fur trading post called Fort Garry, established by the Hudson's Bay Company at the confluence of the two rivers, which eventually became the centre of the Red River Colony and ultimately the city of Winnipeg, capital of Manitoba when the province entered Confederation in 1870. The confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, the very spot where the fur trade post was established, had been one of the most important meeting points on the northern Great Plains for thousands of years before the Hudson's Bay Company arrived. The Forks. That is what the indigenous peoples of the area called it, and that is what Winnipeg calls it today. The Forks, the meeting place, the confluence. It is now a tourist destination, with shops and a market, and a national historic site. But before any of that, before the Hudson's Bay Company, before the Red River Colony, before Louis Riel, before Confederation, the Forks was something else. Archaeological excavations at the Forks, conducted in preparation for the development of the tourist site in the late 1980s, produced one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Canadian history. The excavations revealed evidence of continuous human occupation at the Forks, spanning at least 6,000 years. 6,000 years of human activity at the exact spot where Winnipeg now stands. 6,000 years ago is roughly 4,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza was built. Think about that. The site of Winnipeg has been occupied by human beings for longer than Egypt has had pharaohs. The materials found at the Forks tell a story of a major trading hub. Goods from across an enormous geographic range turned up in the excavations. Obsidian from volcanic sources in the Western Mountains, copper from Lake Superior, marine shells from both the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific coast. Finished goods made from materials that could only have originated thousands of miles from Winnipeg. This was not a campsite. This was not a convenient stopping place where occasional travellers rested and moved on. This was a node in a continental trade network, a place where peoples from across North America came to exchange goods, information, technology, and probably spouses. A marketplace in the deepest sense, a meeting point maintained by the collective agreement of many nations across thousands of years. The Assiniboine people, the Cree, the Anishinaabe, the Dakota, all had significant relationships with the Forks. But the site predates all of these historically documented nations. The people who left the oldest artifacts at the Forks belong to cultural traditions that have no living successors we can identify with certainty, predecessors of the peoples who were there when Europeans arrived. When the Hudson's Bay Company established Fort Garry at the Forks in the early 19th century, they were following the same geographic logic that had made this spot important for 6,000 years. Good water access, protection from floods, more or less. Centrality within the trade network of the Northern Plains. They built a fort at the best location because indigenous peoples had been using the best location for 6,000 years before them. The city that grew around the fort, Winnipeg, capital of the province that was created to accommodate the communities that had grown up around the fur trade. It all flows from that same original recognition. This place matters. But Winnipeg carries an additional layer of historical weight that most Canadian cities do not. The Red River Colony, established in 1812 by Lord Selkirk to settle Scottish and Irish farmers on land purchased from the Hudson's Bay Company, was planted in the middle of Métis territory. The Métis people, descendants of French and Scottish fur traders, and the indigenous women they married and had families with, had built a sophisticated society along the Red River over several generations. They had farms, churches, a distinctive culture, a unique language called Michif, and a clear sense of themselves as a distinct people with rights to the land they occupied. The story of what happened next, the conflict between the Red River Colony and the Métis, the dispossession of Métis lands, the resistance led by Louis Riel, the military suppression of that resistance, the hanging of Riel in 1885, is one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history. But it is also part of the story of what was already there when Winnipeg was built. The Métis presence in the Red River Valley was not an incidental detail. It was a civilization built over generations, rooted in the same geographic logic that had made the Forks important for 6,000 years. Winnipeg was not built on empty prairie. It was built in the middle of someone else's world. Edmonton sits on the North Saskatchewan River in what is now the province of Alberta. The modern city grew from Fort Edmonton, a Hudson's Bay Company post established in 1795, which served as a major supply and trade hub for the Western fur trade. Edmonton became the capital of Alberta when the province entered Confederation in 1905, and it has grown into one of Canada's largest cities, the gateway to the north, the centre of the oil industry that transformed the provincial economy in the 20th century. The North Saskatchewan River. That is the key to understanding Edmonton's location. Like the Ottawa River in the east, the North Saskatchewan was one of the great highways of the interior of the continent, a water route that connected the Rocky Mountains to the eastern plains and beyond. Indigenous peoples had been travelling this river for thousands of years before the first fur trader ever paddled its waters. The Cree, the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Nakota Assiniboine, the Métis, all had significant relationships with the North Saskatchewan River Valley. The Edmonton area, where the river carves through a dramatic valley before continuing east across the plains, was an important location in the territorial geography of multiple nations. But the story of what was there before Edmonton goes deeper than the fur trade era. Archaeological work in the Edmonton area has revealed evidence of human habitation extending back several thousand years. The river valley itself, with its sheltered microclimate and reliable water source, was an attractive location for human settlement across many cultural periods. There is a site near Edmonton called Cooking Lake, which yielded archaeological materials indicating repeated human use over a very long period. There are bison kill sites in the region where indigenous hunters drove herds of bison off cliffs or into enclosures for thousands of years before European contact. The landscape around Edmonton bears the marks of intensive human management across a very long time span. The head-smashed-in Buffalo Jump, a UNESCO World Heritage Site located southwest of modern Calgary, provides a window into the sophistication of the pre-contact cultures of the Western Plains. Indigenous hunters used this site to drive bison herds off a cliff for at least 6,000 years, longer than the pyramids, longer than Stonehenge, a continuous technological and cultural tradition of extraordinary depth. The people who used Edmonton's river valley were part of the same broad cultural tradition, peoples who had developed sophisticated relationships with the bison-dominated ecology of the Great Plains over thousands of years. When the Hudson's Bay Company built Fort Edmonton in 1795, they built it at a location that was already well known to the peoples of the region. The fur traders did not discover the North Saskatchewan River Valley. They were introduced to it by the people who already lived there, who guided them along the routes, who told them where to stop, who traded with them precisely because they were already organized to produce and exchange goods across enormous distances. The city of Edmonton sits on a landscape that has been humanly organized for thousands of years. The river valley parks that Edmontonians prize today, the green spaces along the North Saskatchewan, the wooded ravines that cut through the urban landscape, they follow the same natural geography that indigenous peoples used for millennia. The river is still there, the valley is still there, the city has grown up around and over these features, but they remain, reminders of what was here first. Calgary. The city of the Stampede, the oil towers, the Bow River Valley, the mountains visible on clear days to the west. Calgary's official founding narrative begins in 1875, when the Northwest Mounted Police established Fort Calgary at the confluence of the Bow and Elbow Rivers, ending the whiskey trade that had been devastating the indigenous peoples of the region and establishing Canadian sovereignty over the Western Plains. But the confluence of the Bow and Elbow Rivers was not chosen randomly by the Mounties who arrived in 1875. It was chosen because it was already an important place. The Blackfoot people, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Siksika, the powerful confederacy that dominated the western plains of what is now Alberta, knew this confluence well. So did the Stoney Nakoda people, whose territories extended into the foothills. So did the Cree and the Métis, who moved through the region along the river routes. The Bow River itself was a significant feature in the cultural geography of the western plains. The Blackfoot name for the Bow River, Makoyi Ikimi, means Wolf Trail River, and its banks were used for camps, for ceremonies, for hunting, for travel. The confluence with the Elbow River was a particularly sheltered and well-watered location, a natural meeting point. Below the modern city, the archaeological record is rich. Tipi rings, the circles of stones used to hold down the edges of buffalo hide tents, dot the grasslands around Calgary in considerable numbers. They are evidence of repeated, sustained human occupation across a very long period. Bison bone beds, places where animals were processed after hunts, yield materials dating back thousands of years. The landscape around Calgary shows the marks of intensive human use going back well before the historical period. The whiskey traders whose operations the Mounties were sent to suppress were themselves a symptom of the disruption that followed European contact. Before the whiskey trade, before the disappearance of the bison herds, the Western Plains had supported a sophisticated ecology of human cultures deeply integrated with the bison-dominated grassland ecosystem. The Blackfoot Confederacy, in particular, had developed one of the most impressive adaptations to a particular ecological niche anywhere in North America. Their material culture, their spiritual practices, their political organization, their military capacity, all were finely tuned to the rhythms of the plains bison herds. When the bison disappeared, driven to near extinction by hide hunters in the 1870s and 1880s, that culture was catastrophically disrupted. The Blackfoot people went from prosperity to starvation in the span of a few years. The Mounties, who arrived in 1875, arrived at the beginning of this catastrophe, and the city that grew up around their fort grew in the space that had been violently cleared. Calgary was built in a place that had been someone's home, someone's sacred landscape, someone's world, for a very long time. The Stampede, the annual celebration of cowboy culture that defines Calgary's public identity, is built on the ruins of something much older and much more complex. Now let's go further west. Let's cross the mountains, the Rockies that the fur traders struggled through with their canoes and their packs, and come down onto the Pacific coast, into the rain and the mist, and the enormous old-growth forests that covered the coast of what is now British Columbia. Let's talk about Vancouver. Vancouver's official birth narrative begins in 1792, when Captain George Vancouver of the Royal Navy sailed into the Burrard Inlet and took possession of the territory in the name of the British Crown. The first permanent European settlement in the area came with the establishment of a sawmill at Hastings Mill in 1865. The city of Vancouver was incorporated in 1886, the year the Canadian Pacific Railway reached the coast and the Transcontinental Railway was complete. The railway, the sawmill, the British naval captain, that is the official story of Vancouver. But the Burrard Inlet, the deep water harbour around which Vancouver is built, was not empty or unknown when Captain Vancouver arrived. The coastal peoples of what is now British Columbia were among the most sophisticated and culturally rich peoples in pre-contact North America. Their civilization, based on the extraordinary productivity of the Pacific salmon runs and the bounty of the coastal ecosystem, had produced elaborate art traditions, complex political structures, monumental architecture in the form of longhouses and totem poles, sophisticated trade networks stretching from Alaska to California, and an oral literary tradition of remarkable depth and complexity. The Musqueam people, whose territories encompass the area where Vancouver now stands, had been living on and managing these lands for at least 10,000 years. 10,000 years. The Musqueam themselves say they have been there since time immemorial, which in their tradition means a period so long that specific counting becomes meaningless. The archaeological evidence supports a human presence in the Vancouver area, extending back to at least 8 to 10,000 years before the present. There is a major archaeological site in Vancouver that most residents of the city have never heard of. It is called the Marpole Midden, located in the southwest corner of the city near the mouth of the Fraser River. A midden is an archaeological term for a garbage dump, but indigenous middens are not simply trash heaps. They are layered records of human activity, accumulated over generations, containing the discarded bones and shells and tools, and occasionally the carefully buried dead of people who lived in that location. The Marpole Midden is enormous. At its greatest extent, it covered several hectares and was several meters deep. It represents thousands of years of continuous occupation by Coast Salish peoples at the mouth of the Fraser River. The materials found in the midden include the bones of hundreds of species of fish and marine mammals, evidence of a sophisticated fishing economy. They include elaborate worked bone and antler tools, evidence of high-quality craft production. They include the remains of burials, people interred with grave goods indicating complex social differentiation, status, and ceremony. The Marpole culture, which takes its name from this site, flourished between roughly 2,500 and 1,500 years ago. It was a sophisticated, dense, sedentary culture supported by the extraordinary productivity of the Fraser River salmon runs. Marpole sites in the Vancouver area produced evidence of populations living at densities comparable to contemporary agricultural societies in other parts of the world. And before the Marpole culture, there were older cultures. The archaeological record in the Vancouver area extends back through multiple cultural periods, each representing a distinct adaptation to the coastal environment, each building on the accumulated knowledge of the generations before it. When Captain Vancouver sailed into Burrard Inlet in 1792, he encountered Musqueam and other Coast Salish people who had been living in that landscape for 10,000 years. When the sawmill at Hastings Mill began cutting timber in 1865, it was cutting forests that had been managed by Indigenous peoples for millennia. When the Canadian Pacific Railway reached Vancouver in 1887 and the city began its explosive growth, it grew over and through and around a landscape dense with the physical evidence of 10,000 years of human civilization. The Marpole Midden was destroyed, not gradually, not respectfully, but violently and completely, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as the city grew. Buildings were erected directly over it. Streets were cut through it. The accumulated evidence of millennia of human occupation was bulldozed and paved and built upon without, for the most part, a second thought. This is a pattern that repeats across the history of Canadian cities. The physical evidence of what was there first was destroyed to make room for what was being built, not always out of malice, often out of ignorance, but with the same practical result. The record was erased, the memory was buried, and the new city rose on ground that had been stripped of its history. There is a certain kind of official Canadian amnesia about this. The cities prefer their founding narratives clean and simple. George Vancouver arrived, the railway came, the city grew. What was there before is treated as backdrop, as scenery, as something that preceded the real story rather than being the real story. But the Musqueam are still here. They have never left. Their reserve sits in the western corner of Vancouver, squeezed by the growth of the city to a fraction of its original territory, but still there, still inhabited, still living evidence of the 10,000 years of human civilization that preceded the city. They continue to fish the Fraser River as they have always done. They continue to practice the ceremonies and maintain the cultural traditions that connect them to all those preceding generations. The city of Vancouver was not built in an empty place. It was built in the middle of someone else's 10,000-year-old world. Let's move north. Further north than most Canadians think about when they imagine their country, into the vast territories that make up the majority of Canada's landmass, but are home to only a small fraction of its population. Let's talk about Whitehorse. Whitehorse is the capital of Yukon, a city of roughly 30,000 people sitting on the banks of the Yukon River in the subarctic interior. Its founding narrative is clear and recent, the Klondike Gold Rush of 1898. Tens of thousands of prospectors flooded into the Yukon in pursuit of the gold found in the creeks near Dawson City, and Whitehorse grew as a supply point along the route north. It became the territorial capital in 1953. Gold Rush. That is the story of Whitehorse. But the Yukon River, the great river that runs through Whitehorse and eventually empties into the Bering Sea, was not discovered by gold miners in 1898. Indigenous peoples had been living along the Yukon River and its tributaries for thousands of years, perhaps longer than almost anywhere else in North America, because the Yukon was one of the areas that remained ice-free during the last glacial maximum, a refugium where plants and animals and possibly humans survived the deep freeze that buried most of the continent, the White River Ash. This is something most people have never heard of, but it is one of the stranger elements of Yukon prehistory. Approximately 1,200 years ago, a massive volcanic eruption in the Street, Elias Mountains sent an enormous cloud of ash across the southern Yukon. The White River Ash, as it is called, is visible as a distinct layer in archaeological sites across a huge area. It was devastating to the human populations of the southern Yukon, who abandoned the region following the eruption. The peoples who returned to settle the southern Yukon after the White River Ash event, the ancestors of the present-day southern Tutchone, northern Tutchone, and other Athabascan peoples, found a landscape that bore the scars of a major catastrophe. They built their new communities on top of the ruins of an older world, precisely as the peoples of every other Canadian city have done, though in this case the catastrophe was volcanic rather than colonial. The site of Whitehorse was known to the Kwanlin Dune First Nation, whose traditional territory encompasses the area where the city was built. The Southern Tutchone and other Yukon First Nations had seasonal camps and fish camps along the Yukon River in the area for generations before the gold rush. The site of the city was not empty. It was a working landscape, integrated into the seasonal round of activities that sustained Indigenous communities across the territory. When the gold rush brought its flood of prospectors through the Whitehorse area in 1898 and the town began to grow, It grew in a place that was already occupied, already organized, already embedded in a web of human relationships and cultural meaning. The indigenous peoples of the area were pushed to the margins of their own territories as the new city and its infrastructure took over the landscape. The Kwanlin First Nation, whose traditional territory was effectively occupied by the city of Whitehorse, did not sign a comprehensive land claim agreement with the Canadian and Yukon governments until 2005. The city that sits on their territory is older than that agreement by more than a century. For more than a century, a major city existed on someone else's land without any formal acknowledgement of whose land it was or any negotiated agreement about what that meant. That is another pattern that runs through the history of Canadian cities. The legal and political recognition of Indigenous territorial rights has consistently lagged, often by many decades and sometimes by more than a century, behind the physical occupation of Indigenous territories by growing cities. Now let's talk about something that most discussions of Canadian urban history overlook almost completely. The question of what was there before the most recent Indigenous inhabitants. The peoples we know historically, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Blackfoot, the Coast Salish, the Yukon First Nations, these are the people who were in their territories when Europeans arrived. But they themselves were not necessarily the first people there. They have their own complex histories of migration, displacement, absorption of other groups, and territorial change. The continent had been inhabited for at least 15,000 years, and the peoples who were in any given location in 1492 were not necessarily the same peoples who had been there 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 years earlier. This adds another layer to the story of what was already there, because some of what was already there when European colonists arrived was itself already the remnant of earlier, sometimes larger, sometimes more complex civilizations. Consider the question of pre-contact population. For a long time, European-derived scholarship dramatically underestimated the indigenous population of North America at the time of contact. Early estimates put the pre-contact population of the entire continent at around 1 million people. More recent scholarship, using a variety of methodological approaches including analysis of historical records, comparison with post-contact population figures, archaeological evidence of settlement density, and modelling of the impacts of epidemic disease, has produced radically different estimates. Some researchers now believe the pre-contact population of North America north of Mexico may have been somewhere between 8 and 18 million people. Some estimates go higher. If those higher estimates are correct, then what European colonists encountered in North America was not a sparsely populated wilderness. It was a continent that had supported a large human population for thousands of years, a continent that had been intensively managed, organized, and modified by human activity across a very long time. The epidemic diseases that preceded European settlement into most of the continent's interior killed this population at a rate almost impossible to comprehend. Some estimates suggest that 90% of the pre-contact population of North America died of disease-related causes between 1,492 and roughly 1,700. 90%. If we accept even conservative estimates of the pre-contact population, that means somewhere between several million and over 10 million people died in the 2 centuries following Columbus, most of them before any European ever saw the interior of the continent. The landscape that European settlers encountered when they began moving into the interior of North America was not a primeval wilderness. It was a post-apocalyptic landscape. The forests that seemed untouched to European eyes had been managed by the people who were now dead. The game that seemed impossibly abundant had been managed by the people who were now dead. The cleared lands, the trails, the fish weirs, the earthworks, all the physical infrastructure of the civilization that had preceded European settlement was slowly being reclaimed by nature in the absence of the people who had built and maintained it. When Champlain arrived at the site of Quebec City in 1608 and found no Iroquoian settlement where Cartier had found one in 1535, the disappearance was not mysterious in a vacuum. It was part of a continental catastrophe. When the English settlers of New England described the forests of the coast as being like a park, with open understory and easy walking, they were describing a forest that had been managed by indigenous burning and cultivation for thousands of years. The park was man-made. The makers had died. What European colonists encountered, and what they subsequently built their cities on, was not the natural landscape of a wilderness. It was the ruins of a civilization. A civilization that had been emptied by disease, that had lost most of its population before European settlers ever arrived, that had left its mark on every river valley, every harbour, every strategic confluence where a city would eventually grow. The cities of Canada were not built on empty ground. They were built on ruins. They were built on the remains of a pre-contact civilization that had been catastrophically depopulated, leaving behind landscapes that appeared empty but were, in reality, shaped by thousands of years of human management and occupation. Let's go deeper into this. Let's talk about what archaeologists and historians have found in the places where Canadian cities have been built, the actual physical evidence of what was there before, and let's grapple honestly with how strange and significant some of that evidence turns out to be. Start with the question of trade networks. One of the most striking things that emerges from the archaeology of pre-contact North America is the sheer scale of the trade networks that existed across the continent. This is not a speculative claim. It is supported by very specific physical evidence. Objects made from materials that could only have come from one specific geographic location turning up in archaeological sites hundreds or thousands of miles from that location. Obsidian, the black volcanic glass that was prized for tool-making because it could be knapped into edges sharper than surgical steel, is particularly useful for tracing ancient trade routes because different obsidian sources have distinct chemical signatures. Analysis of obsidian artifacts from archaeological sites across Canada has revealed trade connections of staggering reach. Obsidian, from sources in what is now Oregon and Idaho, has been found at sites in Ontario. Obsidian, from sources in the Rocky Mountains, has been found at sites on the Pacific coast and on the Eastern Plains. These materials move through human hands across thousands of kilometers. Copper from the Lake Superior region was traded even more widely. The native copper deposits of the Lake Superior Basin were the largest known source of naturally occurring metallic copper in the world, and this copper was worked and traded across an enormous geographic area for at least 7,000 years before European contact. Copper artifacts from Lake Superior have been found at sites from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains, from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico. Shell from both the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific coast has been found at sites in the interior of the continent, including sites in the vicinity of several major Canadian cities. At the Forks in Winnipeg, the excavations produced shell beads made from both Gulf Coast and Pacific Coast species, evidence that this site was connected to trade networks that spanned the entire continent. What does this mean? It means that the indigenous peoples of North America, long before European contact, had developed and maintained trade networks of continental scope. These were not simple barter exchanges between neighboring villages. They were sophisticated commercial systems involving specialist production, long-distance transport, and what must have been established protocols for safe passage and exchange across many different territorial boundaries. The rivers that run through Canada's cities were the highways of this continental trade system. The St. Lawrence, the Ottawa, the Saskatchewan, the Fraser, the Yukon, the Red River, the Assiniboine. These rivers were the arteries of a pre-contact commercial civilization, and the places where they converged or where they presented strategic opportunities, the harbours, the confluences, the portages, the narrows, were the nodes of that civilization, and this is exactly where the Canadian cities were built. This is not coincidence. The Europeans who arrived and chose locations for their settlements were not making independent geographic discoveries. They were, in most cases, being guided by indigenous people who already knew the best locations, already knew the best routes, already had established infrastructure at the most strategic points. The fur trade, the economic engine of early Canadian colonization, ran on indigenous knowledge and indigenous infrastructure. The French coureurs des bois who paddled their canoes across the continent were following routes that indigenous people had established. The trading posts that grew into cities were established at locations that indigenous people already used as trading centres. The cities of Canada are, in this very direct sense, indigenous cities. They were built where they were built, because indigenous people knew those places were the best places to be. The European contribution was not the discovery of those places. It was the construction of a new kind of city on top of what was already there. There is a site in southern Ontario that most Canadians have never heard of, despite the fact that it is one of the most significant archaeological discoveries ever made in Canada. It is called Kahiagay, and it was the largest Huron-Wendat village in North America at the time of its occupation, in the early 17th century, just before epidemic disease and the devastating wars of the 1640s destroyed the Huron-Wendat world. Kahiagay was a palisaded town of somewhere between 200 and 300 longhouses, housing an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 people. Some researchers have estimated the population as high as 12,000. If those higher estimates are correct, Cahiers was roughly the same size as the contemporary city of Quebec, and larger than most European cities of its era outside of the major capitals. The site of Cahiers is in Simcoe County, Ontario, north of modern Toronto. The specific location has been identified through archaeological work. The site is today a farm field. There is no monument, no museum, no public recognition of the fact that one of the largest cities in 17th century North America once stood there. The town that Champlain himself visited in 1615, that he described in considerable detail in his journals, where he participated in the famous Battle of 1615 against the Haudenosaunee, where he spent the winter of 1615 to 1616, that town is a farm field. The destruction of Cahiers and the entire Huron-Wendat civilization was rapid and total. The epidemic diseases introduced by the Jesuit missionaries who lived among the Huron in the 1630s killed perhaps half the population in a few years. The Haudenosaunee Wars of the 1640s, in which the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy systematically destroyed the Huron-Wendat towns, killed or dispersed the survivors. By 1650, the Huron-Wendat world that had existed for centuries in the Georgian Bay region was gone. The 5,000 to 10,000 or 12,000 people of Cahiers, the largest city in Ontario at the time, were killed, scattered, adopted into other nations, or sent into exile. The town itself was burned and abandoned. Within a few decades, forest had reclaimed the site. By the time significant European settlement reached the area, there was nothing visible above ground to indicate that an enormous city had stood there. But the history is there, in the soil, in the charcoal and the post holes and the artifacts that archaeologists have been slowly uncovering. Cahiers was real. It was large. It was sophisticated. It was destroyed. And the civilization that built it was erased so completely that most Canadians have never heard of it. This is not ancient history in the sense of being impossibly remote. Champlain visited Cahiers. He wrote about it in detail. The Jesuits who lived among the Huron-Wendat left accounts of their lives in those towns. We have historical records. We know this place existed. We know what it was like. We know what happened to it. And we have chosen, as a society, not to make it a central part of the story we tell about ourselves. Let's talk about earthworks. This is where the history of what was already in Canada gets truly strange, and where the evidence challenges our most basic assumptions about the pre-contact world. When people think of earthworks, they usually think of the Mississippi River Valley, of the Cahokia site near modern St. Louis, where an enormous pre-contact city of 10,000 to 20,000 people built a series of massive mounds that are still visible today, the largest of which, Monk's Mound, contains more earth than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Cahokia is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Its existence as a major pre-contact urban center is not disputed. What is less well known is that earthwork construction was not confined to the Mississippi Valley. It extended into Canada. There are earthworks in Ontario. There are sites in the Thames River Valley and the Grand River Valley in southwestern Ontario that bear the physical marks of deliberate earthwork construction. These are not as large or as dramatic as the Mississippi Valley mounds, but they are real and they are significant. They represent a tradition of organized collective labor in the construction of landscape features that goes back several thousand years. The Serpent Mound site at Rice Lake in Ontario is the only known effigy mound in Canada, a sinuous earthwork built in the shape of a serpent, extending for approximately 60 meters. It dates to approximately 2,000 years ago. It is a provincial park today, and it is genuinely remarkable, a deliberate artistic and ceremonial construction in the landscape that has survived for 2 millennia. But the Serpent Mound is unusual in its preservation. Most of the earthwork sites in Ontario have been destroyed. Agricultural ploughing has levelled them. Urban development has paved over them. Erosion has worn them down. What we have is likely a very small fraction of what originally existed. The peoples who built earthworks in Ontario 2,000 years ago were part of the broader Hopewell cultural tradition, a widespread network of cultures across eastern North America that were connected by trade, by shared ceremonial practices, by similar artistic traditions, and by the construction of elaborate burial and ceremonial earthworks. Hopewell materials have been found at sites across a huge geographic area, and the network they represent was another example of the continental scale organization of pre-contact North American societies. Sites associated with Hopewell tradition peoples have been found in the vicinity of Hamilton, London, and other southern Ontario cities. In each case, The subsequent development of these areas for agriculture and then urban use has destroyed most of the physical evidence. But the evidence that remains is enough to establish that the landscape of southern Ontario, the landscape on which some of Canada's most significant cities have been built, was not simply empty forest and grassland when Europeans arrived. It was a landscape that had been modified, organized, and inscribed with human meaning across thousands of years. The question of agriculture in pre-contact Canada is another area where the conventional story needs significant revision. When we think of pre-contact Indigenous peoples in Canada, we tend to default to the image of nomadic hunters and gatherers, people who moved with the seasons, who followed the game, who gathered wild plants but did not cultivate them. This image is true for some peoples in some regions, but it is badly wrong for others, and it has been used to support the argument that Indigenous peoples did not really occupy or improve the land in any lasting way, and therefore had no claim to it that Europeans needed to respect. This argument was always morally bankrupt. It was also, in many cases, factually wrong. The Haudenosaunee and Huron-Wendat peoples of the Great Lakes region were sophisticated agricultural societies. They cultivated corn, beans, and squash, the Three Sisters, in large, well-managed fields. The Huron-Wendat of the Georgian Bay region were the breadbasket of the fur trade in the early 17th century, supplying the Algonquin hunters and traders who came to their territory with corn in exchange for furs and other goods. The agricultural productivity of the Huron-Wendat allowed them to support large sedentary populations in permanent towns, but it goes further than that. Evidence from the Pacific coast suggests that the coastal peoples of British Columbia were engaged in a form of landscape management that amounted to cultivation even if it did not look like European farming. Camas prairies, open meadows in the coastal forest that were maintained by deliberate burning and that produced enormous quantities of the camas. Lily, whose bulb was a staple food, were not natural features of the landscape. They were created and maintained by human management over long periods. The cessation of that management, following the devastation of the coastal Indigenous populations by disease in the 19th century, allowed the forests to reclaim these open areas. What looks today like natural forest in many parts of coastal British Columbia was, before contact, a carefully managed cultural landscape. The interior plateau peoples of British Columbia, the Secwepemc, the Nlaka'pamux, the Silks, were also engaged in sophisticated landscape management. Burning regimes maintained the grasslands of the interior plateau and promoted the growth of particular plant species. The salmon runs that supported the coastal cultures were sustained by careful management of the spawning streams. The relationships between human communities and the ecological systems they depended on were sophisticated, complex, and the product of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. What the European settlers encountered when they began moving into these territories was not wilderness. It was managed land, land whose management had been disrupted, often catastrophically, by the epidemic diseases that preceded direct contact. The forests were growing back over the Camas prairies because the people who maintained them were dead or dying. The salmon streams were uncrowded because the villages that had fished them for generations were empty or decimated. The grasslands were reverting to shrubland because the burning regimes that maintained them had been disrupted. The wilderness that European settlers perceived was, in large part, a post-apocalyptic landscape recovering from a catastrophe so enormous that it has no real precedent in human history. There is a site that most Canadians have never heard of, located in the province of Nova Scotia, that illustrates everything we have been talking about in a particularly clear and poignant way. The village of Melanson, near the present-day town of Annapolis Royal in Nova Scotia, was an Acadian farming village established in the 1630s. The Acadians were French settlers who came to Nova Scotia and built a remarkable agricultural civilization in the marshlands around the Bay of Fundy, developing an innovative system of dikes and sluice gates called aboiteaux to reclaim the salt marshes for agriculture. The Acadians were eventually expelled by the British in the mid-18th century in one of the great tragedies of Canadian colonial history, the deportation of 1,755. Their villages were burned, their farms destroyed, their communities scattered across the Atlantic world. The site of Melanson became, like so many other places in this story, abandoned land where nature slowly reclaimed what humans had built. But before the Acadians, before the French, this area was Mi'kmaq territory. The Mi'kmaq people had been living in Nova Scotia for at least 10,000 years. Their territory encompassed all of what is now Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and parts of Quebec and Maine. Their culture was a sophisticated adaptation to the rich marine environment of the Atlantic coast, based on fishing, hunting marine mammals, and gathering shellfish, supplemented by inland hunting and gathering. The site where the Acadians built their village at Melanson sat in a landscape that had been used by Mi'kmaq peoples for a very long time. The marshes that the Acadians diked, the land they farmed, the streams they used, all of it was embedded in a Mi'kmaq geography of names, stories, use rights, and spiritual meaning. And before the Mi'kmaq of the historical period, there were older cultures. The Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia has been occupied by human beings since the glaciers retreated, at least 10,000 years ago, and possibly longer. The evidence of this long occupation is everywhere in the archaeological record, in the shell middens that dot the coastline, in the ancient campsites revealed by eroding banks, in the artifacts pulled from the soil by farmers and development projects. The town of Annapolis Royal, the oldest continuously European-occupied settlement in Canada, north of Florida, sits in a landscape that was already ancient when the first French settlers arrived in 1605. The layers of history there are extraordinary. European colonialism laid on top of Acadian farming culture, which was itself laid on top of thousands of years of Mi'kmaq occupation, which was itself laid on top of even older cultural traditions. Every major Canadian city is Annapolis Royal. Every major Canadian city is built in a landscape with those kinds of layers. Let's go back to the most mysterious element of this whole story, the disappearance. Not just of the people of Hochelaga, though that disappearance is striking enough, but of the peoples who preceded, the peoples who were there at contact, the pre-Iroquoian inhabitants of the St. Lawrence Valley, the pre-Blackfoot inhabitants of the Alberta Plains, the pre-Yukon Athapascan inhabitants of the territory after the White River volcanic eruption, the Laurentian archaic peoples whose burial sites are found across eastern Canada, the Plano peoples who followed the retreating glaciers onto the newly deglaciated landscape, all the peoples whose names we do not know, whose languages have left no trace, whose cultures survive only as artifacts in museum cases and charcoal stains in the soil. The story of pre-contact Canada is a story of change, of civilizations rising and falling, of populations moving and being replaced, of cultural traditions appearing and disappearing, of languages being spoken and then ceasing to be spoken, of cities being built and then being abandoned and then being forgotten. The Europeans who arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries were not the first people to build a civilization in this landscape, and they were not the first people to build that civilization on top of the ruins of something older. What they were was the most recent. The most recent in a long series of peoples who came to this landscape, who organized it according to their needs and knowledge, who built their world here and called it home, and who in many cases did not survive the changes that came after them. The difference is that the European civilization that replaced the pre-contact world did not simply replace it in the way one culture had sometimes replaced another in the pre-contact period, through migration or displacement or absorption. The European civilization arrived with catastrophic diseases that killed the population before they even knew Europeans were there. It arrived with ideologies that denied the humanity and the civilization of the people it was displacing. It arrived with economic and military power that could not be resisted. And it arrived with a legal and philosophical framework that declared the land empty and available even when it was not. The result was not just replacement, but erasure. The attempt to destroy not just the cultures and the peoples, but the memory that they had ever existed. The attempt to present the Canadian landscape as empty before the Europeans arrived, as virgin territory waiting for civilization, as a gift of nature rather than the homeland of a civilization. And the cities that were built in this landscape, the cities that are the subject of this entire investigation, are the most visible expression of that erasure. Because where a city stands, the land beneath it is inaccessible. You cannot dig there. You cannot see the layers below. The city covers its foundations and presents a clean face to the world, a face that begins with Champlain or John Graves Simcoe or John By or whoever arrived with the first European maps and the first European surveys and the first European tools to build the first European structures. The city says, this is where history begins. But the ground says otherwise. In the last 20 or 30 years, something has been changing. Slowly, incompletely, unevenly, but changing. The legal framework of Indigenous rights in Canada has been evolving through a series of Supreme Court decisions and constitutional amendments that have increasingly recognized the reality of Indigenous territorial rights and the obligations of the Crown to consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples whose rights are affected by development. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which operated from 2008 to 2015, and produced a comprehensive report on the history and legacy of residential schools, brought the broader history of colonialism in Canada into public consciousness in a way that had not happened before. The calls to action that the TRC issued included many related to education, to the recognition of Indigenous history, to the revision of the Canadian historical narrative to include what had been there before. The discovery of unmarked graves at former residential school sites, beginning in 2021, while not a surprise to survivors and Indigenous communities who had long known about them, brought the scale of the colonial project home to many Canadians who had not fully grasped it. Land acknowledgements. The practice of formally acknowledging the Indigenous peoples on whose traditional territory a gathering or an institution is located have become standard practice at many universities, government bodies, and public events across Canada. These are small things, in some ways. They do not return land, they do not undo what was done, they do not rebuild what was destroyed, but they represent a beginning, the beginning of a collective reckoning with the question of what was already there, a question that this entire story has been exploring, because the question of what was already there is not merely historical, it is present. The peoples whose civilizations preceded the Canadian cities we have been discussing are still here. The Musqueam are still in Vancouver, the Kwanlin Dun are still in Whitehorse, the Algonquin people are still in the Ottawa Valley, the Mi'kmaq are still in Nova Scotia, the Cree and Blackfoot are still on the plains, the Haudenosaunee are still in Ontario. The Huron-Wendat, though their 17th century world was destroyed, were not entirely destroyed themselves. A community of Huron-Wendat people has been living at Wendake, near Quebec City, continuously since the catastrophes of the 17th century. These peoples carry in their cultural memory, in their languages, in their oral traditions, in their ceremonies and spiritual practices, the history of what was there before the cities. They carry it not just as history, but as living knowledge, as connection to the land and the water and the sky that their ancestors have known for thousands of years. And in recent years, this knowledge has begun to flow back into the public conversation about Canadian cities in ways that are changing how those cities understand themselves. In Toronto, the city has officially recognized the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, a pre-contact agreement between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples to share and care for the lands around the Great Lakes. The city has begun to include acknowledgement of this treaty in its official communications and events, recognizing that the territory on which Toronto stands was already the subject of sophisticated, long-standing political agreements among Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. In Vancouver, the city has been engaged in a long process of consultation and negotiation with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, whose territories overlap with the city's geographic footprint. The city's official land acknowledgement recognizes these three nations' territories. The Musqueam and other nations have been involved in urban planning processes in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. In Winnipeg, the Forks site, the 6,000-year-old meeting place at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, has been developed into a public space that explicitly acknowledges and celebrates its Indigenous history. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights, located at the Forks, includes galleries on Indigenous history and rights. The site's long history as a meeting place is reflected in the public programming and design of the space. In Ottawa, the federal government has been engaged in treaty negotiations with the Algonquin Nation, whose traditional territory encompasses the Ottawa River Valley and includes the ground on which the nation's capital sits. These negotiations, if successful, would result in a comprehensive land claim settlement for the territory that Parliament Hill occupies. These are beginnings. They are incomplete, contested, and inadequate in many ways. The gap between acknowledging that a city sits on Indigenous territory and actually doing something meaningful about that reality is enormous, and most Canadian cities remain much closer to acknowledgement than to action. But something is shifting. The question of what was already there, the question that this story has been asking from the beginning, is becoming harder to ignore. There is one more layer to this story that we have not yet fully addressed, and it is perhaps the most speculative but also the most intriguing. What if the story goes even deeper than we think? The conventional archaeological narrative of pre-contact North America, the one taught in textbooks and presented in museums, is built on a body of evidence that is growing but is still fragmentary. We know that humans have been in North America for at least 15,000 years. We know they spread rapidly across the continent following the retreat of the glaciers. We know they developed increasingly sophisticated cultures over time. We know that by the time of European contact, some of those cultures were extraordinarily complex. But there are gaps in the record. Enormous gaps. The record is fragmentary because organic materials do not survive well over long periods. Because coastal sites, where early populations likely concentrated, are now underwater due to post-glacial sea level rise. Because the catastrophic depopulation of the contact period disrupted the cultural transmission that would have preserved knowledge of earlier periods. Because the physical destruction of sites by agricultural and urban development has erased evidence that can never be recovered. What we know is almost certainly less than what there is to know. There are sites in North America that suggest the story may be longer and more complex than the conventional narrative allows. In the Yukon, a site called Bluefish Caves has produced evidence that has been interpreted by some researchers as suggesting human presence in North America as far back as 24,000 years ago, well before the conventionally accepted date of entry. The interpretation is contested, but the evidence is real and continues to be debated. In coastal California and Oregon, DNA analysis of ancient skeletal remains has produced results that do not fit neatly into the conventional model of a single migration across the Bering Land Bridge. Multiple genetic lineages are present in ancient North American populations, suggesting either multiple migrations or a population history more complex than a single founding event. The Kelp Highway hypothesis, which proposes that the first Americans may have traveled down the Pacific coast by boat, following the kelp forests that fringe the North Pacific, would place the earliest human presence on the Pacific coast of North America in a time before the interior routes were open, and would suggest coastal settlements that are now underwater, invisible to us because the sea has covered them. What does any of this mean for our question? For the question of what was already there when the Canadian cities were built? It means the story might be even longer than we think. The layers beneath the Canadian cities might go deeper than the conventional 15,000 years. The civilizations that preceded the Europeans might have had predecessors that preceded them by a longer and more complex chain than we currently know. We are, in this area of knowledge, still very much in the early stages of understanding. The evidence is accumulating, the interpretations are evolving, and the conclusions we will eventually reach may be very different from the ones we currently hold. What we can say with confidence is this: the ground beneath the Canadian cities is not simply rock and clay, it is time. Layer upon layer of human time, human presence, human civilization, stretching back further than we usually allow ourselves to think. Let's come back to the present. Let's stand on a street in Montreal, or Toronto, or Vancouver, and look around at the city that surrounds us, and think about what we now know. The concrete under our feet covers ground that was a cornfield 450 years ago. The glass towers reflect light onto streets that follow the routes of indigenous paths. The parks and river valleys that we think of as natural features are the remnants of a managed landscape whose managers are mostly gone. The rivers that we have straightened and dammed and channeled were once the highways of a continental trade network. The city, any Canadian city, is a palimpsest. A palimpsest is a manuscript that has been scraped clean and written over, but where traces of the earlier writing still show through. The Canadian cities are palimpsests, in which the earlier writing has been mostly erased but never entirely. The traces show through everywhere, if you know how to look. They show through in the shape of the land, in the courses of the rivers, in the locations of the parks and green spaces that preserve, often accidentally, the geography of the pre-contact world. They show through in the names, the indigenous names that persist in anglicised or gallicized form, even when the people who gave those names have been pushed to the margins. They show through in the archaeological sites that keep turning up under construction projects and parking lots and riverbanks, the physical evidence of what was there before. They show through in the faces and the voices of the indigenous peoples who are still here, who have never stopped being here, who carry in their bodies and their memories and their cultural traditions the deep history of these places, the history that the cities have tried so hard to bury. And they show through in the growing awareness that the story we have been telling about Canada, the story that begins with the Europeans and presents what came before as backdrop or prehistory, is incomplete. Is, in some ways, a lie. Not necessarily a deliberate lie, but a lie of omission, a lie that erases in order to simplify, that covers in order to claim. The truth is more complicated, more interesting, more humbling. The truth is that every major Canadian city was built on top of something that was already there, something that had been there for a very long time, something that represented a civilization, or many civilizations, of considerable sophistication and depth. Something that was not simply swept away by the arrival of Europeans, but was partially destroyed, partially survived, partially transformed, and partially continued underground, beneath the city, in the soil and the water and the memory of the people who were there first. The truth is that we are still living in the middle of this story. The cities are still here. The peoples whose civilizations preceded them are still here. The negotiations over land and rights and recognition are still ongoing. The archaeological evidence is still being uncovered and analyzed. The historical narrative is still being revised and contested. The truth is that the question of what was already there is not a question about the past. It is a question about the present and the future. It is a question about what kind of country Canada is and what kind of country it is going to choose to become. Standing on the banks of the Fraser River in Vancouver, watching the salmon still run, you can feel something of what has been lost and what has survived. The salmon themselves are a kind of continuity, a living link between the pre-contact world and the present. The Musqueam have been fishing these salmon for 10,000 years. The salmon have been running this river for longer than that. The river itself, the Great Fraser, the largest salmon-bearing river in North America, is still here, still running, still producing, though diminished, still connecting the city to the deep time of the landscape it occupies. In Winnipeg, standing at the forks where the Red and Assiniboine meet, you can see the stones that were placed by the developers of the modern public space to acknowledge the ancient meeting place. You can read about the 6,000 years of occupation that preceded the fur trade in the city. You can look at the two rivers coming together, the same confluence that drew human beings to this spot for 6,000 years, and understand something about why geography is destiny, why the physical world shapes human history in ways that persist across enormous spans of time. In Ottawa, standing on the riverbank and looking across to Quebec, you can see the same river view that Algonquin peoples saw for thousands of years, that Champlain saw in 1613, that the Rideau Canal builders saw in 1826. The river is still there. The great rocks in the river are the Chaudière Falls, the falls that were sacred to the Algonquin people and that were eventually dammed for industrial power. Those rocks are still there. The dams are there too, built on top of what was sacred, obscuring but not entirely erasing what was there before. In every Canadian city, these moments are available to anyone who is willing to look for them. The moments where the palimpsest shows through, where the earlier writing becomes briefly visible, where the depth of the history underneath the city becomes apparent. These are not comfortable moments. They carry with them a weight of history that can be difficult to sit with, a weight of what was lost, of what was destroyed, of what was deliberately erased in service of a simpler and more flattering story about the birth of Canada. But they are also moments of genuine wonder, because the story that shows through is remarkable. It is a story of human civilizations that were sophisticated, complex, and long-lasting. It is a story of peoples who managed this landscape with intelligence and care for thousands of years. It is a story of continental trade networks, of sophisticated political organizations, of artistic traditions of great power and beauty, of ecological knowledge that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. It is a story worthy of being told, worthy of being known, worthy of being part of the Canadian understanding of who we are and where we come from. The work of uncovering this story is still ongoing. Archaeologists are still excavating. Historians are still revisiting the documentary record. Indigenous scholars and elders are still sharing knowledge that has been preserved in oral tradition through generations of catastrophe. Geneticists are still analyzing ancient DNA. Linguists are still studying the relationships among indigenous languages. The picture that is emerging is not complete. It may never be complete. Too much has been lost. Too many sites destroyed, too many oral traditions disrupted, too many languages silenced, too many generations killed before they could pass on what they knew. But what is emerging is already extraordinary. A picture of North America before European contact that is richer, more complex, more populous, more organized, and more deeply historical than the simplified narrative of the empty wilderness has ever allowed. The ground under every major Canadian city is part of that picture. Each city sits on a specific piece of the pre-contact world, a piece that was significant in its own right, that was chosen for good reasons, that often long preceded European arrival, and that carries in its soil and its rivers and its geography the accumulated weight of thousands of years of human presence. Montreal, built on the ruins of Hochelaga, a city of several thousand people that existed at the center of the street. Lawrence Iroquoian whirled and vanished before anyone could explain where it went. Toronto, built at the terminus of an ancient trade route used for 1,000 years before John Graves Simcoe ever looked at the harbour and decided it was a good place for a capital. Quebec City, built at a strategic narrowing of the river that was already understood and used as a key geographic node for centuries before Champlain drove his first stake into the ground. Ottawa, built on the banks of a river that was one of the great trade highways of the continent, in a landscape inhabited for 8,000 years before Lieutenant Colonel By began his canal. Winnipeg, built at the Forks, a meeting place used continuously for 6,000 years, a place whose significance as a trading hub predates the pyramids. Edmonton, built on the banks of a river that was the main highway of the interior West for thousands of years, in a landscape shaped by thousands of years of Indigenous presence and management. Calgary, built at the confluence of two rivers that were central to the territorial geography of the Blackfoot Confederacy, on a landscape dense with the physical evidence of 10,000 years of human occupation. Vancouver, built on the territories of peoples who had been managing the coastal landscape for 10,000 years, over the physical remains of their civilization which were largely destroyed in the process of building the city. Whitehorse, built in territory that had been inhabited for longer than almost anywhere else in North America, at a location that was already an important node in the indigenous geography of the Yukon River Valley. And in every case, what was there before was not nothing. What was there before was civilization, different from European civilization in its forms and expressions and values, different in its relationship to the land and to the non-human world, different in its political organization and its economic systems and its spiritual practices, but civilization nonetheless. Human beings organizing their world, managing their landscape, producing art and ideas and institutions, raising children and burying their dead, telling stories and asking questions about the meaning of it all. The cities built over that civilization are not simply built on empty ground. They are built on foundations they did not build and do not fully recognize. And every once in a while, the ground reminds them. In 2021, workers doing construction in downtown Vancouver encountered archaeological remains. In 2022, a transit project in Montreal uncovered Indigenous artifacts. In any given year, somewhere in every major Canadian city, the soil gives up something from before. A pottery shard, a stone tool, a bone, charcoal from a fire that burned a very long time ago, the physical remains of the world that was there first. These discoveries are not anomalies. They are the normal condition of building a city on top of a civilization. The ground is full of what came before. The cities are built on it and surrounded by it, and penetrated by it at every turn. Every major construction project is, in some sense, an archaeological event. And as the methods of archaeology improve, as remote sensing and ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR and ADNA analysis open new windows into the pre-contact world, the picture is becoming clearer. We are learning, slowly and incompletely, but genuinely, what was there before. We are learning to read the landscape beneath the landscape, to see the city that preceded the city. This is not only an academic exercise, though it is certainly that. It is also a moral and political exercise. Because the question of what was already there is inseparable from the question of what happened to it, and the question of what happened to it is inseparable from the question of what responsibilities we carry today. If the cities were built on civilizations that were already there, if those civilizations were destroyed or displaced in the process of building those cities, if the descendants of those civilizations are still here and still asserting their rights and their presence, then the history of what was already there is not only past, it is present, it is ongoing, it is unfinished. Let us end where we began, with a question. Why those specific places? Why did the cities grow where they grew? The answer is geography. Good harbours, navigable rivers, defensible high ground, access to resources, proximity to trade routes. But here is the real answer, the deeper answer, the answer that the evidence demands. The cities grew where they grew because those places were already known to be good. They were already known to be central. They were already nodes in a pre-existing network of human organization and activity. The Europeans who came and built their cities did not discover those places. They were led to them, guided to them, introduced to them by the peoples who already lived there and had been living there for a very long time. The cities of Canada are not European inventions planted in a new world. They are the latest expression of a much older human recognition of what this landscape has to offer. They are the newest version of a story that has been told and retold in these specific places for thousands of years. And the full version of that story, the one that includes everything that was already there, is stranger and richer and more significant than the simplified version that begins with the Europeans and ignores everything that came before. The ground beneath the Canadian cities is not simply rock and clay and fill. It is time, accumulated human time, the physical record of thousands of years of human presence in these landscapes. The cities were built on something, many things, many civilizations, many peoples, many stories, and those stories do not stop when the city begins. They continue beneath the streets and under the foundations, in the rivers and the earth and the memory of the people who were there first. The ground is speaking. If you listen closely enough, you can hear it. Everything you have just heard is a beginning, not an end. The story of what was already there when the Canadian cities were built is still being written. New discoveries are made every year. New interpretations of old evidence are proposed and debated. New voices, Indigenous voices that were long excluded from the conversation, are adding to and challenging the conventional narrative. The cities themselves are slowly beginning to grapple with these histories. Slowly, imperfectly, inadequately, but genuinely. The acknowledgement of what was there before is becoming part of how the cities understand themselves, part of the civic identity that is being constructed for the 21st century. It is a complicated and unfinished process. The gap between acknowledgement and genuine reckoning is enormous. The gap between knowing that a city sits on Indigenous territory and actually honouring what that means in practical terms is wider still. The path from where Canada is now to where justice might require it to go is long and uncertain, but the story is being told now in ways it was not told before. The ground is being read in ways it was not read before. The question of what was already there is being asked, and some answers are beginning to emerge. The answer, in every case, in every city, in every landscape we have examined, is the same. There was already so much there, so much history, so much civilization, so much life. And some of it is still there, beneath everything that was built on top of it, waiting to be found, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be remembered. The Canadian cities sit on something ancient, something deep, something that was already extraordinary before the first European ship ever rounded the headland, and the captain looked at the shore and said, "There, that is where we will build." They did not know how much was already built, but the ground did. The ground always knew. Let's go back and dig deeper into each of these cities, because what we've covered so far is the outline, the architecture of the mystery, but the mystery itself is made of details, and the details are where the true strangeness lives. Let's start with a detail about Montreal that most people, even most Montrealers, don't know. When archaeologists excavated beneath the old city of Montreal, in preparation for various infrastructure projects over the past several decades, they found evidence that the island of Montreal was not simply a convenient stopping place or a logical trading hub. It was something more than that. The island sits at the heart of a geography that was understood by the peoples who lived there as having spiritual as well as practical significance. Mont Royal, the mountain that sits at the centre of the island and that gives the city its name, is not simply a hill. In the cosmology of the peoples who inhabited this region, elevated places, places where the earth reaches toward the sky, were points of connection between the human world and the world of spirits and ancestors. The mountain was not just a geographic feature, it was a sacred site. This is not unique to Montreal. Almost every mountain, every significant river confluence, every dramatic cliff face in Canada's urban landscape had, for the peoples who lived in those landscapes before European contact, a sacred dimension that was inseparable from its practical importance. The sacred and the practical were not separate categories in pre-contact Indigenous thought. A river was both a trade route and a living being. A mountain was both a landmark and a spiritual presence. A good harbour was both a practical shelter and a place where the boundaries between worlds were thin. When Europeans arrived and began building their cities, they brought with them a very different way of understanding landscape. For the European tradition, the landscape was primarily material. It was a resource to be exploited, a space to be organised, a background against which human activity took place. It was not itself a community of beings with whom you had relationships and obligations. It was not itself alive in any meaningful sense. This difference in worldview is not simply philosophical. It had, and continues to have, practical consequences. A people who understand a landscape as alive, as a network of relationships requiring respect and reciprocity, will interact with that landscape very differently from a people who understand it as inert material. The pre-contact management of the Canadian landscape, the burning regimes that maintained open habitats, the fish weirs that captured salmon without depleting the runs, the harvesting protocols that left enough to ensure next year's crop. All of these practices flowed from a worldview in which the landscape was understood as a partner rather than a resource. The European colonial approach, which treated the landscape as a resource to be extracted and a space to be reorganized, produced rapid short-term gains and long-term ecological damage, whose full extent we are only now beginning to understand. The salmon runs that supported the coastal peoples of British Columbia for 10,000 years have been reduced to a fraction of their historical abundance in the century and a half since intensive European commercial fishing began. The bison herds that supported the plains cultures were eliminated in a few decades of commercial hunting. The forests that covered vast areas of Canada have been logged at rates that no pre-contact culture ever approached. The contrast between these two ways of relating to landscape is stark, and it helps explain something about why the question of what was already there matters so much. Because what was already there was not just a civilization that happened to be in the way of a different civilization. It was also a way of understanding and relating to the landscape that, had it been respected rather than destroyed, might have preserved the ecological foundations on which all civilization in Canada ultimately depends. Let's talk about Halifax. Halifax is the capital of Nova Scotia, established in 1749 by British colonists who were specifically tasked with counterbalancing the French presence at Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. The town was planned and built quickly on a hillside overlooking a magnificent natural harbour, and it grew rapidly into a major naval and commercial port. The official story of Halifax begins in 1749, but the harbour at Halifax was not unknown before the British arrived. The Mi'kmaq people, whose territories encompassed all of what is now Nova Scotia, called the harbour Chiboucto, which roughly translates as the Great Long Harbour. The name is telling. This was a recognised place with a recognised name, a harbour that Mi'kmaq people knew well and used regularly. The Mi'kmaq had been living in and travelling through what is now Nova Scotia for at least 10,000 years. Their seasonal round took them along the coast and into the interior, following the salmon rivers inland in spring and returning to the coast for the summer harvest of marine resources. The great harbour at Chiboucto was a natural gathering point, a sheltered anchorage that they had been using for generations. When the British chose this harbour for their new fortified town in 1749, they were choosing it for the same reasons the Mi'kmaq valued it. It was an excellent harbour, deep and well protected, with a narrow entrance that was easy to defend. It was centrally located in the larger geography of the Atlantic coast. It had access to fresh water and to the forested interior. The Mi'kmaq, who had initially maintained a kind of tolerant coexistence with the small and scattered French settlements of Acadia, were much more troubled by the founding of Halifax. The British were not simply traders or farmers. They were establishing a military and political centre from which they intended to control the region, and their intentions toward the Mi'kmaq were hostile. The Cornwallis administration that founded Halifax offered bounties for Mi'kmaq scalps, a fact that has become a significant point of controversy in Halifax's recent history. The statue of Edward Cornwallis that stood in a Halifax park for decades became a flashpoint in the debate over how the city reckons with its founding history, and it was eventually removed in 2018 after significant public debate. The removal of the statue did not resolve the underlying questions. What does it mean that Halifax was built in a place that was already Mi'kmaq territory? What does it mean that its founding was accompanied by a declared policy of genocide against the people who were already there? What obligations does that history create for the city today? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that arise when you take seriously the inquiry into what was already there. The harbour at Chiboucto is still there. The Mi'kmaq are still here. The ground on which Halifax was built still carries in its layers the evidence of the 10,000 years that preceded the British fortifications. St. John, New Brunswick, occupies a particularly interesting position in the story of Canadian cities built on top of what was already there, because the what that was already there in this case is unusually dramatic and unusually well documented. At the mouth of the St. John River, where it enters the Bay of Fundy, the Maliseet people, whose name for themselves is Wolastoqiyik, meaning the people of the beautiful river, had their traditional homeland. The St. John River, which they called the Wolastoq, meaning the good river or the beautiful river, was the heart of their world. The Wolastoqiyik were a sophisticated agricultural and fishing people. They cultivated crops in the river valley. They maintained extensive fish weirs along the river and at its mouth. They had a complex political organization with established relationships with neighboring nations, including the Mi'kmaq and the Passamaquoddy. They were skilled diplomats, experienced traders, and formidable warriors. The location of modern St. John, at the mouth of the Wollastock where it meets the Bay of Fundy, was one of the most significant places in the territorial geography of the Wollastock-Yik. The river was their highway, their food source, and in a deep sense, their identity. The place where the river met the bay, where fresh water met salt water, where the enormous tides of the Bay of Fundy created the spectacular reversing falls, was a place of particular power and significance. The reversing falls. This natural phenomenon, where the tidal surge of the Bay of Fundy is so powerful that it actually reverses the flow of the St. John River, pushing salt water up through the gorge into the river above, was understood by the Wollastock-Yik as a place of spiritual significance, a place where the forces of the world were visible and palpable in a way they were not elsewhere. European colonists arrived in the St. John area in the early 17th century, establishing trading posts and eventually the fortified town that became St. John. They built their fortifications and their wharves and their streets on the same ground that the Wollastock-Yik had occupied and used and valued for thousands of years. The Wollastock-Yik resisted the colonial occupation of their territory through a series of wars that lasted intermittently throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the Mi'kmaq Wars or Dummers War, or the various conflicts that punctuated the colonial period in Atlantic Canada. Eventually, exhausted, depleted by disease, and outgunned by British military power, they were confined to reserves and their lands were taken. But the Wollastock is still there. The reversing falls still reverse, twice a day, with the rhythm of the Bay of Fundy's tides. The Wollastock-Yik are still here. Their river, the beautiful river, still runs through the heart of the city that was built on their territory, still a living presence in the landscape, still connecting the city to the deep time of the pre-contact world. Let's go west again, to a city that doesn't often appear in discussions of Canadian urban history, but that carries in its landscape some of the most profound pre-contact history in Canada. Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, the city of bridges on the South Saskatchewan River, the heart of the province that was the last part of the Canadian prairies to be settled by Europeans, the province whose identity is inseparably tied to wheat and homesteading and the long flat horizon. But before the homesteaders, before the railway that opened the prairies to settlement in the 1880s and 1890s, before the town that grew up as a temperance colony in 1882, the South Saskatchewan River Valley at the location of modern Saskatoon was not empty prairie. It was a significant place in the territorial geography of the Cree, the Nakota Assiniboine, and the Métis peoples who moved through and lived in the northern plains. The river itself was a highway. The valley provided shelter in a landscape where shelter was otherwise scarce. The river crossing at the location of modern Saskatoon, where the natural topography made the river easier to ford, was a known and used feature of the pre-contact landscape. But the deeper history of the Saskatoon area goes further back than the historical period. The northern plains of Saskatchewan have been inhabited by human beings since the retreat of the glaciers, at least 10,000 years ago. The landscape is dotted with archaeological sites, taipi rings, bison kill sites, medicine wheel sites, all evidence of the long human presence on these grasslands. The medicine wheels of the northern plains are among the least understood but most striking evidence of pre-contact cultural complexity in Canada. These are large structures, sometimes hundreds of meters in diameter, made of stones arranged in patterns that typically include a central cairn connected to an outer ring by a series of spokes, sometimes with additional stones marking specific directions or alignments. Medicine wheels have been found across the northern plains from Alberta to Montana and beyond, and they date from several hundred to possibly several thousand years ago. The medicine wheel at Moose Mountain in Saskatchewan is one of the most studied examples. Astronomical analysis suggests that the spoke alignments correspond to sunrise at the summer solstice and possibly to the rising points of certain stars. The medicine wheel at Bighorn in Wyoming, across the border, shows similar astronomical alignments. These are not random stone arrangements. They are organized, geometrically precise constructions whose alignments suggest sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Who built them? The peoples who are using the northern plains 2,000 years ago are not the same, or not demonstrably the same, as the peoples who were there at the time of European contact. The medicine wheels predate the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Cree, the Nakota Assiniboine, all the nations whose territories encompass the northern plains at the time of contact. They are the work of peoples whose identities we do not know, whose languages have not been recovered, whose stories have not been passed down in a form we can access. Beneath Saskatoon, beneath the wheat fields that surround it, beneath the ranches and the roads and the river crossings, the landscape carries the marks of these unknown peoples, carries them in the stone arrangements that farmers have had to plough around for generations, carries them in the archaeological sites that keep turning up in river cut banks, carries them in the soil itself, layered and rich with the evidence of human presence across a very long span of time. Prince George, British Columbia, sits at the confluence of the Fraser and Nechako rivers in the interior of the province, a city that grew from a fur trade post established by Simon Fraser in 1807. It is a forestry and resource industry city, the largest city in the northern interior of British Columbia, a place whose identity is tied to the forest and the river and the long cold winters of the interior plateau. The confluence of the Fraser and Nechako rivers, where Prince George sits, was a significant place in the territorial geography of the Leadley Tene people, whose name means the people where the rivers come together. The name is precise. It describes exactly the geographic feature that made this place important, the confluence of two major rivers. The Leadley Tene are a Darkel nation, part of the broader family of Dene-speaking peoples, whose territories stretch across a vast area of the interior of British Columbia, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. Their culture was adapted to the interior plateau environment, based on fishing, particularly salmon fishing on the Fraser and its tributaries, hunting, and gathering of the resources of the boreal forest. The site of Prince George was a fishing and gathering place for the Leadley Tene for thousands of years before Simon Fraser ever paddled up the river that now bears his name. The confluence of the two rivers created favourable conditions for salmon fishing. The broader area provided hunting grounds and plant gathering areas that sustained the community through the year. When the Northwest Company established a trading post at the confluence in 1807, they were establishing it at a place that the Leadley Tene already knew was the best place to be. The fur trade followed indigenous geography, as it always did. The traders knew where the resources were because the indigenous peoples who brought those resources to trade told them. The city that grew around the trading post, as the forestry industry developed in the 20th century and Prince George became a regional centre, was built on and around the traditional territory of the Leadley Tene. The people whose name means the people where the rivers come together were progressively displaced from the very place their name describes as they watched their territory consumed by the growing city. Let's talk about something that the physical evidence of the pre-contact world consistently reveals but that our conventional history often obscures: the sheer intelligence of the people who were here before. Not intelligence in the reductive sense of IQ or cognitive capacity, intelligence in the sense of accumulated wisdom, sophisticated knowledge systems, deep understanding of complex systems. The kind of intelligence that only develops over very long periods of careful observation, experimentation, transmission, and refinement. Consider the indigenous fisheries management systems of the Pacific coast. The salmon runs that supported the coastal cultures of British Columbia were not simply a natural abundance that indigenous peoples harvested passively, they were actively managed. The fish weirs and traps that are sometimes presented as simple technologies were, in practice, sophisticated management tools that required careful calibration to ensure that sufficient numbers of fish passed upstream to spawn and maintain future runs. Oral traditions among Pacific coastal peoples include protocols governing when and how much fish could be taken. These protocols were not simply traditional customs. They were empirically derived rules for maintaining the productivity of a biological system. They embodied the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of observation of salmon population dynamics, knowledge that modern fisheries biologists have only arrived at relatively recently through the tools of Western science. The knowledge encoded in these traditions was sophisticated enough to maintain productive salmon runs in the rivers of British Columbia for thousands of years. The application of Western commercial fishing methods, which did not include these protocols, reduced the salmon runs to a small fraction of their historical abundance in the space of a few generations. Or consider the fire management practices of the interior plateau peoples of British Columbia. The grasslands of the interior plateau, the open parkland environments that support deer and elk, and a variety of plant foods, were not natural features of the landscape in the sense of being untouched by human management. They were maintained by regular burning. Indigenous peoples burned the landscape deliberately and systematically to promote the growth of certain plant species, to create habitat for game animals, to maintain travel corridors, and to reduce the fuel load that would otherwise accumulate and make catastrophic fire more likely. This knowledge was sophisticated. It required understanding of fire behavior, of plant ecology, of weather patterns, of the seasonal rhythms of the landscape. It required coordination among community members to execute burns safely and effectively. It had to be adjusted to local conditions that varied from valley to valley and year to year. When the colonial government imposed fire suppression policies across British Columbia in the early 20th century, prohibiting the burning practices that Indigenous peoples had used for thousands of years, the result was the rapid accumulation of fuel loads in the forests and grasslands. The catastrophic wildfires that have become a regular feature of British Columbia summers in recent decades are, in significant part, a consequence of that suppression of Indigenous fire management practices. The knowledge that was lost when those practices were prohibited was not primitive or superstitious. It was sophisticated, empirically derived, and functionally effective. It was, in the literal sense, better than what replaced it. This pattern repeats across the different types of knowledge that pre-contact cultures had developed: agricultural knowledge, medical knowledge, ecological knowledge, astronomical knowledge. In every domain, the peoples who preceded European settlement had developed knowledge systems that were sophisticated, empirically derived, and functionally effective. In many cases, more effective than the Western systems that replaced them, at least in the specific contexts for which they had been developed. The erasure of these knowledge systems was not a neutral consequence of cultural replacement. It was a loss with real, ongoing, practical consequences. We are still living with those consequences. There is a particular dimension of the story of what was already there that deserves more attention than it usually receives. The question of language. Before European contact, North America was one of the most linguistically diverse places on Earth. Hundreds of distinct languages were spoken on the continent, belonging to dozens of unrelated language families. The linguistic diversity of pre-contact North America rivaled that of New Guinea, which is considered the most linguistically diverse place on Earth today. This is not a trivial fact. Linguistic diversity reflects deep time. Languages diverge from common ancestors very slowly. The enormous diversity of indigenous languages in North America indicates that people had been living in this landscape in relatively isolated communities, developing distinct linguistic traditions for a very long time. The linguistic evidence is one of the strongest arguments for a long human presence in North America, possibly longer than the conventional 15,000-year estimate. Many of these languages are now extinct, or nearly so. The process of language loss was accelerated by the residential school system, which explicitly aimed at eliminating indigenous languages by removing children from their communities and punishing them for speaking their mother tongues. Hundreds of indigenous children died in residential schools. Hundreds of thousands were traumatized. The languages they were forbidden to speak are dying with the generations that were punished for using them. In the vicinity of every major Canadian city, the pre-contact landscape had a name in at least one indigenous language, often several. Many of the features of the urban landscape retain, in anglicized or gallicized form, their original indigenous names. The words themselves are fragments of a linguistic world that was much larger and richer. Toronto is a Mohawk word. Ottawa comes from the Algonquin Odawa, referring to the nation and the river. Saskatchewan comes from a Cree word for swift current. Winnipeg comes from a Cree or Ojibwe word meaning muddy water. Canada itself, the name of the country, comes from the Huron-Wendat word Kanata, meaning village or settlement, which Cartier heard and applied to the territory. The names are still here, embedded in the landscape even as the languages from which they come are threatened or lost. The cities of Canada speak indigenous languages in their own names, even as those languages are dying. The recovery and revitalization of indigenous languages is not simply a cultural or sentimental project. It is a matter of knowledge recovery. Because the knowledge encoded in those languages, the ecological knowledge, the geographical knowledge, the historical knowledge, the spiritual knowledge, exists in those languages in a form that cannot be fully translated or transmitted in any other medium. When a language dies, a particular way of understanding the world, a particular body of knowledge developed over thousands of years, dies with it. The question of what was already there, then, includes what was already known. And what was already known was encoded in hundreds of languages that the colonial project has spent centuries trying to destroy. Let's go back to the physical evidence one more time, because there are some details in the archaeological record that, when you sit with them, are genuinely arresting. In the area around modern Hamilton, Ontario, archaeologists working over the past several decades have identified the sites of multiple Haudenosaunee villages that predate European contact and the devastating epidemics that followed. These were large settlements, some with populations in the thousands, clustered in the productive agricultural lands of the Hamilton-Burlington area. The villages were not randomly distributed. They were positioned in relation to agricultural land, water sources, defensive terrain, and each other in ways that reflect careful planning and sustained community organization. And they moved. The Haudenosaunee villages of the pre-contact period were typically relocated every 10 to 20 years, when the agricultural land immediately around the village had been exhausted, and the forests within easy reach had been cleared for firewood and building material. They would establish a new village nearby, allowing the old site to recover, and after several generations, they might return to an earlier location. This system of rotation managed the landscape sustainably across a very long period. The same general territory supported large sedentary populations for centuries because the village sites were moved rather than the land being continuously exploited to exhaustion. When archaeologists map these village sites, they find a pattern of occupation across the landscape that represents centuries of continuous habitation, with each village lasting a generation or two before being abandoned and replaced nearby. The soil at the old village sites, enriched by years of occupation and the decomposition of organic material, is identifiable in core samples. The charcoal from the hearths is datable. The whole pattern of pre-contact occupation in the Hamilton area can, with sufficient archaeological work, be read from the soil. What this means is that the landscape of the Hamilton area was not simply occupied at the time of contact. It had been occupied, continuously and intensively, for centuries before that. The European settlers who arrived in the late 18th and early 19th centuries and established what would become Hamilton were not settling an empty or lightly used landscape. They were establishing themselves in territory that had been actively cultivated and managed for at least several centuries by Haudenosaunee peoples. The irony is that those European settlers benefited, in a practical sense, from the pre-contact occupation. The land that they found most productive for agriculture was, in many cases, land that had been cleared and cultivated by Haudenosaunee farmers before them, whose abandoned village sites and former fields were incorporated, without acknowledgement, into the new colonial landscape. And then there is the question of what has been found beneath the cities that we do not yet fully understand. There are rock art sites across Canada, petroglyphs and pictographs, images carved or painted on rock faces that predate any historical documentation of the peoples who made them. Some of these sites have been dated to several thousand years ago. Some of the imagery they contain does not correspond to any documented cultural tradition, suggesting that it was made by peoples whose cultures are otherwise unknown to us. Near Peterborough, Ontario, there is a remarkable complex of petroglyphs that are among the largest known concentration of indigenous rock carvings in North America. The Peterborough petroglyphs, now protected as a provincial park and a National Historic Site, consist of approximately 900 carvings on a marble outcrop depicting human figures, animals, boats, and abstract symbols. They were made by Algonquin-speaking peoples and are believed to be between 500 and 1,000 years old. What is particularly striking about the Peterborough petroglyphs is their location. The rock on which they are carved sits over an underground stream, and in certain conditions the sound of water moving through the rock can be heard. The site appears to have been chosen precisely because of this acoustic phenomenon. The carvers chose a rock that sang, and they covered it with their images. This is not simple. This reflects a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between the carved images, the living rock, and the water that moved through it. It reflects a worldview in which the boundaries between the human world and the world of spirits were permeable, in which certain places were understood as nodes of connection between those worlds. The Peterborough petroglyphs are not in a city, but they are not far from Peterborough, which is not far from Toronto, and they represent a tradition of spiritual and artistic engagement with the landscape that extended across the entire region in which the Canadian cities were subsequently built. When the settlers arrived and established their farms and their towns and eventually their cities, they were moving into a landscape that was layered with this kind of meaning. A landscape in which specific rocks and rivers and hills and confluences had specific significance, had been sites of ceremony and prayer and artistic expression for generations. The settlers did not see any of this. They saw, or chose to see, empty land, good land, available land. They did not see the inscribed landscape of a civilization that had been building meaning into the physical world for thousands of years. But the inscriptions remain. The carvings are still there. The sacred springs are still flowing. The old growth trees on the promontories that were too steep to log still stand. The layers of human meaning still exist in the landscape, beneath and around and between the cities, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be understood. Let's talk about something that happens in cities, something that is so ordinary that we barely notice it. The way a city changes the land it sits on. A city is not just buildings, it is a hydrological intervention. It changes the way water moves through the landscape. Streets and roofs and parking lots prevent rainwater from soaking into the soil, forcing it instead into storm drains and eventually into rivers. The rivers themselves, in most Canadian cities, have been altered, straightened, channeled, dammed, diverted. In Toronto, most of the rivers that once ran through the city have been buried. The Don River, which once meandered across a broad, marshy valley floor on the east side of the city, has been channeled into a concrete sluice. The Garrison Creek, once a significant stream running through the west end of the city, has been entirely buried, existing now only as a pattern of subtle topographic undulation in the neighbourhoods built above it, and in the name of a small park that marks its former course. These buried rivers were not simply water, they were ecosystems, travel corridors, food sources, sites of gathering and ceremony for the peoples who lived in this landscape before the city came. The salmon that once ran in them are gone. The wetlands that once filtered them are gone. The springs that once fed them are mostly buried, but the water still tries to find its way. In wet years, basements flood in neighbourhoods built over former wetlands. Springs emerge from hillsides where they have been emerging for thousands of years. Regardless of what has been built above them, the water has memory. It follows the paths it has always followed, even when those paths are blocked or buried. The indigenous peoples who managed these landscapes before the cities came understood the water, understood the seasonal rhythms of flooding and drought, understood which areas were safe to build on and which were not. That knowledge was lost when the peoples were displaced and the cities were built without reference to it. We are now relearning it the hard way. Toronto's periodic flooding disasters, the events where underpasses fill with water and basements flood and creeks overtop their banks, these are in significant part consequences of building a city without adequate respect for the hydrology of the landscape, without the knowledge that was already there. The relationship between the Canadian cities and the waters they were built on deserves its own extended consideration. Every major Canadian city is a water city. Toronto on Lake Ontario, Montreal on the St. Lawrence, Quebec on the Street, Lawrence at the confluence with the St. Charles, Ottawa on the Ottawa River at the confluence with the Rideau, Winnipeg at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine, Calgary on the Bow and Elbow, Edmonton on the North Saskatchewan, Vancouver on Burrard Inlet at the mouth of the Fraser, Halifax on the harbour at Chiboucto, St. John at the mouth of the Wollastock. Each city is defined by its water, and in every case, that water was a defining feature of the pre-contact world as well. Not just a resource, but a relationship. Not just a transport medium, but a living presence in the cultural landscape. The rivers that run through the Canadian cities were not simply rivers to the peoples who lived along them. They were entities, persons in a more than metaphorical sense. They had names that acknowledged their nature as beings rather than just features. They had protocols governing how they should be approached, how their gifts should be received, what reciprocities were owed for the fish they provided and the water they gave. These protocols were not arbitrary superstitions. They were embedded knowledge about how to maintain a productive relationship with a living ecological system. The protocols around salmon fishing on the Pacific coast, for example, included behaviours that, when translated into the language of fisheries biology, turn out to correspond to effective population management. Allowing the first salmon to pass upstream without being taken so that the run could establish itself before harvesting began corresponds to ensuring adequate spawning escapement. Taking fish in rotation from different parts of the river, rather than concentrating harvest in one location, corresponds to reducing fishing pressure on local populations. The spiritual language in which these protocols were expressed, the language of relationship and reciprocity with the salmon as persons rather than the salmon as a resource, may seem foreign to modern Western ears, but the behaviours it produced were functionally effective. They maintained productive fisheries for thousands of years. We know this because the salmon runs were still abundant when Europeans first arrived. They had not been depleted by 10,000 years of indigenous fishing. They were depleted in the century and a half of commercial fishing that followed European contact. The protocol worked, the relationship worked, the knowledge worked, and then it was taken away. There is a philosophical dimension to this whole story that is worth making explicit. because it changes how we think about the relationship between the Canadian cities and the civilizations they were built on. The conventional Western understanding of history tends to be linear and progressive. Civilizations rise and fall, and each successive civilization is understood as building on what came before, advancing, improving, progressing. In this framework, the European colonization of North America was a step forward, the arrival of a more advanced civilization in a landscape previously occupied by less advanced ones. This framework is wrong in a very specific and demonstrable way when it comes to the relationship between European colonial civilization and the pre-contact civilizations of North America. Because in many of the dimensions that actually matter, the pre-contact civilizations were not less sophisticated than what replaced them. They were differently sophisticated. In some domains, they were more sophisticated. The sustainable management of the ecological systems that support human life is one of those domains. The knowledge systems that enabled pre-contact cultures to maintain productive fisheries, abundant game populations, and productive agricultural landscapes for thousands of years were not primitive. They were sophisticated, and they worked over timescales that European civilization has not yet demonstrated it can match. The question of what was already there, then, is not simply a question about history. It is a question about knowledge. What was known before the cities were built? What was understood? What kinds of intelligence about the living world had been developed over thousands of years of careful attention, transmitted through generations of careful teaching, and applied with care and deliberation to the management of complex ecological systems? That knowledge was largely destroyed. The people who held it were killed or displaced or removed from the landscapes their knowledge was about. Their children were taken from them and forbidden from learning what their parents knew. The land itself was reorganized in ways that made much of the traditional knowledge irrelevant, because the ecological systems that knowledge was about had been transformed beyond recognition. But some of it survived. In the oral traditions of peoples who maintained their cultural practices against enormous pressure, in the bodies of traditional knowledge that are now being systematically documented and transmitted to younger generations as part of the indigenous language and culture revitalization movements. In the land itself, which still carries the marks of the older management regimes, still holds in its soil and its hydrology and its ecological structures the evidence of what was done here before. And in the growing recognition, both among Indigenous peoples and in the broader Canadian society, that the knowledge lost when those civilizations were disrupted was real, was valuable, and needs to be recovered if we are going to navigate the ecological crises of the 21st century. The question of what was already there, in other words, is not simply a question about the past. It is a question about what we need to know now and where we might look to find it. Let's come back to Earth. Let's walk through one more city in detail, and let's try to hold in mind simultaneously the city as it exists now and the landscape as it was before. Let's walk through Victoria, British Columbia. Victoria is the capital of British Columbia, a city of about 90,000 people on the southern tip of Vancouver Island, across the Strait of Juan de Fuca from Washington state. It is known for its British colonial architecture, its temperate climate, its famous gardens, its tourist trade. It markets itself as a little bit of Old England on the Pacific coast. The Lekwungen peoples, specifically the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, have been living in the Victoria area for at least 10,000 years, possibly longer. The southern tip of Vancouver Island, with its mild climate, its sheltered harbours, its productive shellfish beds and salmon streams, was one of the most desirable pieces of real estate in the entire Pacific Northwest. The Lekwungen peoples were not simply passing through. This was their home, their centre, their world. The harbour at Victoria, which the British named after the young Queen when they established Fort Victoria in 1843, was called Kamasak or Kamasoon by the Lekwungen, a name referring to the rush of water through the tidal inlet that formed part of the harbour. It was an excellent harbour, sheltered, deep, easily defensible, with access to fresh water from Bowker Creek and other streams, and surrounded by productive land and sea. The Hudson's Bay Company built Fort Victoria in 1843 as a replacement for Fort Vancouver to the south, which was in territory that was increasingly likely to become American rather than British. They chose this location because it was the best natural harbour on the southern coast of Vancouver Island. The Lekwungen knew this. They had been living there for 10,000 years because it was the best place to be. When the fort was established and the town of Victoria began to grow, the Lekwungen were initially accommodated in a small way. The Hudson's Bay Company employed some Lekwungen people. Trade relationships were established. But as the town grew, particularly with the Fraser River Gold Rush of 1858, which brought tens of thousands of people to Victoria almost overnight, the Lekwungen were progressively displaced. Their villages were in the way. The land they occupied was land that the growing city needed. They were moved to reserves, small parcels of their original territory, as the city took the rest. Today, the Songhees Reserve sits just across the harbour from downtown Victoria. You can see it from the Inner Harbour Walkway, a small spit of land where the large and beautifully designed Songhees Hotel now stands, where traditional big houses have been rebuilt, where the nation's cultural and governmental activities continue. The Esquimalt Nation is nearby, in the area that has been a Canadian naval base since the 1860s. The Lekwungen peoples are still here, still in sight of their original territory, still fishing, still gathering, still practicing the ceremonies and the cultural traditions that connect them to the 10,000 years of human presence in this landscape. The city of Victoria markets itself to tourists as a piece of old England. It is, in fact, a piece of a much older story, a landscape that has been home to human beings for 10,000 years, whose culture and knowledge and relationship to this specific place are far deeper than any colonial heritage. The gardens that Victoria is famous for, the Butchart Gardens, the government gardens, the carefully tended public parks, they grow in soil that was managed and tended by Lekwungen peoples for thousands of years before anyone thought to plant English roses there. The soil has memory. And so we come to the final and perhaps most important question that this whole investigation raises. What do we do with this? We now know, or we are beginning to know, that the Canadian cities were built on civilizations that were already there, that those civilizations were sophisticated, long-lasting, and remarkable, that their destruction was catastrophic, violent, and largely deliberate, that the peoples who built those civilizations are still here, diminished but not destroyed, carrying in their bodies and their cultures the evidence of everything that was lost and everything that survived. We know that the knowledge developed by those civilizations over thousands of years was real and valuable, that much of it was destroyed or suppressed, and that some of what was lost is knowledge we desperately need now as we confront the ecological crises of our time. We know that the legal and political recognition of Indigenous rights in Canada has been incomplete, often dishonest, and painfully slow. That the gap between the constitutional promises made to Indigenous peoples and the actual treatment of Indigenous communities has been, and remains, enormous. We know that the process of reckoning with this history, which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission tried to begin, has barely started. That reconciliation, if it means anything real, requires something much more than acknowledgement. It requires the kind of structural change that most Canadian cities, most Canadian governments, and most Canadians have not yet been willing to make. This is not a comfortable place to sit. It does not resolve neatly. The history does not have a tidy conclusion. The cities are there. The peoples whose territories the cities occupy are there. The obligations that flow from the history of what happened between them are there, whether they are acknowledged or not. What we can do, at a minimum, is to stop telling a simplified story, to stop pretending that the cities begin with the Europeans, that what was there before is merely backdrop, that the pre-contact world was empty or primitive or unimportant, to insist that the full story, the story of what was already there, be told and heard and grappled with. The ground beneath the Canadian cities knows the full story. The soil holds the layers of what was there before, layer upon layer of human time, of human presence, of human civilization reaching back thousands of years before the first European ship ever appeared on the horizon. The cities were built on something, and the something they were built on was already extraordinary. The question is whether we are going to acknowledge that, not just in words, not just in land acknowledgements read at the beginning of meetings, but in the deeper and harder ways that genuine reckoning requires. The ground is still speaking. Whether we are ready to listen is another question entirely. And perhaps that is where the story ends, not with a resolution but with a question, the same question that the physical evidence of the pre-contact world raises every time a construction project uncovers another pottery shard, another fire pit, another human burial beneath the streets of a Canadian city. What was already there? And what does it mean that we built on top of it? Those questions are still alive. They are not historical curiosities. They are the defining questions of the country we are in the process of becoming, if we choose to become it honestly. The answer begins with looking at what is beneath our feet and listening to what it says. We have been talking about cities, about the ground beneath them, about what was there before. But there is another way to approach this question, a way that opens up even more of the strangeness and the depth of the pre-contact world. Let's talk about time. Not just the time spans we have already mentioned, the 10,000 years of occupation in Vancouver, the 6,000 years at the Forks in Winnipeg, the 9,000 years of human presence at what would become Toronto. Let's think about what those time spans actually mean, what they feel like when you try to hold them in your mind. 6,000 years. Think back 6,000 years. That is roughly the time separating us from the beginning of the Bronze Age in the Middle East, from the first cities of Mesopotamia, from the earliest written texts. When someone first sat down at the Forks in Winnipeg, when the first family set up camp at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers and decided to stay, civilization as we usually define it, the civilization of writing and cities and bronze was just beginning to emerge on the other side of the world, and it would be another 4,000 years before anyone in Europe would hear the word Kichisipi. In those 6,000 years at the Forks, how many generations lived and died? How many children were born and learned to walk by the water's edge and grew up and had their own children? How many languages were spoken? How many songs were sung? How many stories were told about those particular rivers? About the particular way the water moved at that particular confluence? We will never know most of it. The oral traditions that carried those stories have been disrupted. The languages in which they were told are threatened. The people who knew the oldest layers of the story are gone. But the place is still there. The water still converges. The land still holds in its soil the charcoal and the bones and the artifacts of 6,000 years of human life. The place carries its history even when the people cannot fully access it. This is what distinguishes a place from a space. A space is merely a location, a coordinate, a point on a map. A place is a location saturated with human meaning, with history, with stories, with relationships between the human and the non-human. A place has depth, and the depth of the places where the Canadian cities were built is almost incomprehensible. Let's go even further back, into the period before the current geography of Canada had fully formed. When the glaciers retreated from most of Canada between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, they did not leave behind the landscape we know today. They left behind a different world. Much of what is now the interior of Canada was covered by glacial lakes, enormous bodies of meltwater held back by retreating ice dams. Lake Agassiz, which, at its greatest extent, covered an area larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined, occupied the region where Winnipeg now sits. The Champlain Sea, a marine incursion into what is now the Ottawa and Street, Lawrence Valleys, covered the ground where both Quebec City and Ottawa were later built with salt water for several thousand years. The first human beings to come into these landscapes were exploring genuinely new territory. They were walking through a world that had never been seen by human eyes, across ground that had been buried under kilometers of ice for tens of thousands of years. The plants were colonizing the bare rock and gravel left by the glaciers. The animals were following the plants, and the people were following both. The archaeology of this earliest period in Canada is fragmentary, for obvious reasons. Sites were buried under glacier deposits, or flooded by the post-glacial lakes, or erased by the repeated disturbance of a rapidly changing landscape. But there are sites. A few dozen sites across Canada that have yielded archaeological materials dating to the period immediately following glacial retreat, 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, give us a glimpse of who these first inhabitants were and how they lived. They were not primitive. They were brilliant. Coming into a new landscape requires the full deployment of every cognitive resource a human being possesses. You have to learn everything from scratch. Which plants are edible, which are toxic, where the animals go in different seasons, where the water sources are, which materials make good tools, where shelter can be found, how the weather behaves, how the rivers flood and how the ice forms and when it is safe to cross. The people who first settled the post-glacial Canadian landscape did all of this without any previous knowledge of the specific environment they were entering. They brought with them a toolkit of general skills and knowledge developed in other environments, and they applied that general knowledge to the specific challenges of this new world. They were improvising, experimenting, adapting, and they succeeded. Within a few thousand years of the retreat of the glaciers, human communities were established across the landscapes that would eventually become the sites of Canadian cities. Those communities developed specific adaptations to their specific environments. The technologies, the knowledge systems, the cultural practices that characterized each regional culture at the time of European contact were the product of thousands of years of adaptation to specific landscapes, developed by people who were paying exquisitely close attention to the world around them. This is the deep foundation of what was already there when the Canadian cities were built. Not just centuries of occupation, not just a few generations of indigenous settlement, but thousands of years of accumulated adaptation, experiment, and knowledge. There is something that archaeologists call site formation processes, and understanding it helps explain why the evidence of the pre-contact world has been so difficult to recover from beneath the Canadian cities. When a site is buried, either by natural sediment deposition or by the deliberate addition of fill in preparation for construction, the archaeological materials in that site are preserved, at least partially, but they are also transformed. Organic materials, wood, bone, plant material, human remains survive only under specific conditions. They survive well in very dry environments, like the deserts of the American Southwest. They survive well in very wet, airless environments, like bogs. They survive poorly in the moderate, seasonally variable, aerobic soil conditions that characterize most of the Canadian landscape. What this means is that the archaeological record of the pre-contact world in most Canadian cities is heavily biased toward durable materials. Stone tools, ceramics, fired clay, burnt bone, these things survive. Wooden structures, leather garments, woven baskets, carved objects, these things mostly do not. The physical evidence we have is a small and unrepresentative sample of the total material culture of the pre-contact world. But even that small sample tells us a great deal, and occasionally, under exceptionally favourable preservation conditions, we get glimpses of the organic world as well. There is a site in British Columbia called the Bear Gulch site, where waterlogged conditions preserved wooden tools, basketry, and other organic materials dating back several thousand years. The complexity and quality of the preserved objects is striking. Carefully woven baskets, carved wooden bowls, implements for fishing and food preparation that reveal a sophisticated material culture far richer than the durable stone tools alone would suggest. The pre-contact world was a world full of beautifully crafted objects in wood and hide and plant fiber and feathers and hundreds of other materials that do not survive. The world we can reconstruct from the archaeological record is a stripped and simplified version of a much richer material world. Understanding this helps us resist the temptation to equate the apparent simplicity of the archaeological record with actual simplicity of the cultures that produced it. The cultures that built the Canadian cities were not simple. They were complex, rich, sophisticated, and beautiful. The fact that most of the evidence of that beauty has been lost to time and to the destructive processes of urban development does not change what was there. Let's talk about art. Not just the rock art of the petroglyphs and pictographs, though that art is remarkable. Let's talk about the broader tradition of visual and material art that existed in the pre-contact world across the territory that became Canada. The art of the Pacific Coast cultures of what is now British Columbia is among the most distinctive and remarkable visual art traditions in the world. The totem poles, the carved house posts, the painted screens, the bent wood boxes, the ceremonial masks, the woven blankets, all of these represent a sustained artistic tradition of extraordinary sophistication. The formal conventions of Pacific Northwest Coast art, the split representation technique, the use of formline design, the integration of animal and human imagery, these are not simple decorative conventions. They are a complex visual language with its own grammar, capable of conveying precise narrative and symbolic content. This tradition was ancient. The specific objects that have survived, because they were made of wood and most wood does not survive, are relatively recent, but the tradition itself extends back into the deep past. The stone sculpture and the bone carving found at archaeological sites in coastal British Columbia show that the formal conventions of Northwest Coast art were being applied to durable materials thousands of years ago. And yet, when European settlers arrived on the coast of British Columbia, they saw the art around them and called it primitive, childish, grotesque. They saw the totem poles and described them as idols to be destroyed. Missionaries persuaded or coerced indigenous communities to burn their ceremonial objects. Potlatches, the ceremonial distributions of wealth that were the central institutions of the coastal cultures, were prohibited by Canadian law from 1885 to 1951. Indigenous peoples who continued to practice their ceremonies during this period faced prosecution and imprisonment. The art survived, partly. Some objects were preserved in museums, removed from their communities without consent, classified and stored and studied by the very civilization that had tried to destroy the tradition they represented. Some objects are still in those museums, and the question of their repatriation has become one of the significant issues in the relationship between Canadian museums and Indigenous communities. The art also survived in the communities that held onto the traditions through the years of suppression. The master carvers who continued their work despite the prohibitions, the women who wove their blankets in secret, the families who maintained the ceremonial knowledge through generations when its public expression was forbidden. Their persistence meant that when the prohibitions were lifted, the traditions were not entirely lost. The revival of Pacific Northwest coast art in the second half of the 20th century, the work of artists like Bill Reed and Robert Davidson and others who studied the older forms and carried them into the present, is one of the remarkable cultural stories of Canada. But it should not be necessary to celebrate it primarily as a revival, as the recovery of something lost. It should be celebrated as the continuation of a tradition that was always alive, that survived an attempt to destroy it. The art that decorates the airports and public spaces of Vancouver and Victoria and other British Columbia cities, the art that has become part of the visual identity of the region, is not decoration. It is the surface expression of a civilization that was here before the cities, that continues to be here despite everything that was done to end it, and that has enriched the visual culture of the country beyond measure. The interior plains of Canada, the vast grasslands that stretch from the Manitoba border to the Rocky Mountain foothills, are less often thought of as a landscape rich in pre-contact civilization, but the evidence is there, for anyone who looks: the bison. The great herds that once covered the plains in numbers that observers described as darkening the horizon, that moved in patterns governed by seasonal rhythms and weather, and the availability of water and grass. The bison were not simply wild animals moving randomly across an empty landscape. They were managed in the sense that indigenous peoples had learned their patterns and behaviors well enough to predict and influence their movements. The driving of bison into pounds, enclosures of wood and brush, or over cliffs, required detailed knowledge of bison behavior and sophisticated organization of human labor. It was not simple, and it produced results. The bison herds of the northern plains were, at the time of European contact, and for the generation or two of contact before the hide hunters arrived, almost certainly larger than at any previous point in their history. There is evidence that the introduction of the horse, which reached the northern plains from the south in the 18th century, allowed indigenous peoples to manage the bison herds more effectively, and that the horse period of the mid-18th to mid-19th century was a kind of peak of cultural and ecological flourishing on the northern plains. The destruction of the bison herds in the 1870s and 1880s was not an ecological accident. It was a policy. The Canadian and American governments understood that the elimination of the bison would break the economic and cultural foundation of the plains cultures, forcing the plains peoples onto reserves and ending their resistance to colonial settlement. The hide hunters who killed the bison in their millions were doing the work of the colonial state, whether or not they understood it in those terms. When the last great herds disappeared, in the space of a few years in the early 1880s, they took with them the foundation of a civilization that had flourished on those plains for thousands of years. The Blackfoot Confederacy, the Assiniboine, the Cree, the Plains Ojibwe, all the nations whose cultures were organized around the bison, faced starvation almost immediately. Within a decade, they had signed treaties ceding their territories to the Crown and accepting confinement on reserves. The cities of the prairie provinces grew up in the landscape that had been cleared for them by the elimination of the bison and the forced removal of the peoples who depended on them. Calgary, Saskatoon, Regina, Lethbridge, the whole constellation of prairie cities was built on a landscape that had been violently emptied in the span of a single generation. This is not ancient history. The last of the great bison herds was killed within the lifetime of people who could still have been living when the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation was founded, when the Trans-Canada Highway was built, when the National Film Board first turned a camera on the Canadian landscape. Living memory barely reaches back to the world before the cities, but it reaches. Let's talk about the relationship between rivers and memory, because it is one of the most persistent and interesting features of the landscape of pre-contact Canada. Rivers remember, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a physical sense. A river carries sediment downstream and deposits it when its velocity decreases. The deposits form layers, each layer corresponding to a particular period of time. Those layers, when examined by a geomorphologist or a geoarchaeologist, tell the story of the river's history, the story of the landscape it has been moving through, and the story of the human presence in that landscape. Archaeological materials enter rivers in various ways. Artifacts wash off eroding riverbanks. Items are dropped or thrown into the water intentionally. Sites along the riverbank are gradually undercut and collapse into the river. These materials settle into the river sediment and are buried, preserved in the layers of silt and sand that accumulate on the riverbed and the floodplain. When archaeologists conduct underwater surveys of Canadian rivers, or when they excavate the floodplain deposits along riverbanks, they find these buried materials. And what they find tells the same story that every other line of evidence in this investigation has told. The rivers were used, continuously and intensively, for a very long time, by many peoples, across many cultural periods, for many purposes. The Ottawa River has yielded archaeological materials from its bed and banks at multiple locations, dating across a span of thousands of years. The St. Lawrence has produced similar evidence. The Fraser River in British Columbia has archaeological sites along its banks that date back 8,000 years and more. The North Saskatchewan River has yielded evidence of human use going back several thousand years at minimum. These rivers were not empty when the fur traders first paddled them. They were well-travelled highways, their banks lined with the accumulated evidence of generations of human activity. The fur traders paddled their canoes through a landscape dense with human history, though most of them had neither the knowledge nor the inclination to read what that landscape was telling them. And the rivers carry forward not just archaeological evidence but ecological memory. The salmon that run in the Fraser River today are the descendants of salmon that have been running that river for thousands of years. The populations of salmon in specific tributaries are locally adapted to those specific waterways, products of thousands of generations of selection for the particular conditions of those rivers. That local adaptation is a biological memory of deep time, encoded in the genetics of the fish rather than the artifacts in the sediment, but no less real for that. The rivers remember, and the cities that were built along them, that altered their courses and buried their tributaries and filled their floodplains with concrete and asphalt, have been having a difficult relationship with that memory ever since. Let me tell you about a specific archaeological project that illuminates the whole of what we have been discussing. In the 1990s, the city of Ottawa decided to renovate the Majors Hill Park, a green space in the heart of the city adjacent to the Chateau Laurier Hotel and overlooking the Ottawa River. In preparation for the renovation, the city commissioned an archaeological survey of the park. What they found was unexpected. Beneath the park, in layers of soil that had been disturbed but not entirely destroyed by 2 centuries of Ottawa's history, there were indigenous artifacts, pottery fragments, stone tools, charcoal from old hearths, evidence of human occupation extending back at least 4,000 years. Majors Hill Park, in the heart of the national capital, a few steps from the Parliament buildings and the National Gallery of Canada, on a point of land overlooking the Ottawa River, had been an Indigenous use site for 4,000 years before it became a British garrison, and then a Victorian park, and then a site of urban renovation. This discovery did not stop the renovation. The archaeologists documented what they found, removed the most significant artifacts for study and preservation, and the renovation proceeded. The park today shows no sign of its 4,000-year archaeological history. There is no interpretive panel, no marker, nothing to indicate that the ground on which the tourists and the bureaucrats and the schoolchildren walk has been a gathering place for human beings for 4,000 years. This is normal. This is what happens, again and again, in the cities of Canada. The archaeology is done, the evidence is documented, the artifacts go into storage in museum collections, and the development continues. The city absorbs what was beneath it and presents its clean face to the world. But the evidence was there. The ground knew. And if you stand in Majors Hill Park today and look out over the Ottawa River and the cliffs of the Quebec shore, you are standing in a place that human beings have been standing in for 4,000 years, looking at much the same view, feeling much the same river wind, listening to much the same sound of fast water over rocks. The continuity is real, even when it is invisible. There is a tradition in many Indigenous cultures, including several of the nations whose territories encompass the major Canadian cities, of what might be called landscape literacy. The ability to read the land itself as a text, to see in the topography, the hydrology, the plant communities, the animal behavior, evidence of history that extends far beyond living memory. A person trained in landscape literacy knows things that are invisible to untrained eyes. They know that a certain cluster of plants indicates an old campsite, because those plants thrive in the disturbed and nutrient-rich soil of places where people camped and cooked and left their waste. They know that a certain pattern of tree growth indicates the location of an old trail, where the trampling of feet and the management of the forest edge over generations shaped the vegetation in ways that persist long after the trail itself is overgrown. They know that a certain configuration of the ground surface indicates a buried feature, an earthwork or a filled depression or a concentration of artifacts, because the drainage pattern of the soil surface reflects what lies beneath. This is a form of knowledge that the people who study the pre-contact world desperately need and only partly have access to. The academic archaeologists and historians who reconstruct the pre-contact world from physical evidence are working, in most cases, without the landscape literacy that would allow them to read the land directly. They are dependent on excavation, on the physical removal and laboratory analysis of soil and artifacts, to learn what a person trained in the indigenous tradition of landscape literacy might be able to read from the surface. There are indigenous knowledge keepers who still possess this skill. Elders who can walk through a landscape and read its history the way others read a book. Their knowledge is not being adequately incorporated into the archaeological and historical understanding of the pre-contact world, partly because the methodological and conceptual frameworks of academic archaeology are not set up to receive it, and partly because the relationships between indigenous communities and academic institutions are still too burdened with the history of colonial extraction to allow the kind of trust and collaboration that would be necessary. This is changing, slowly. The field of indigenous archaeology, which insists on community-led and community-controlled research into the pre-contact past, is growing. The recognition that indigenous oral traditions and landscape knowledge are legitimate forms of historical evidence, rather than simply supplementary or anecdotal material to be filtered through the academic framework, is spreading. But the pace of change is slow relative to the pace at which the landscape is being developed. The sites destroyed, the knowledge lost. The window for recovering what can still be recovered is not unlimited. Let's talk about the night sky. Before the cities, before the electric lights that now drown out the stars for most urban Canadians, the night sky over the territories that are now Canada was brilliant. The Milky Way was visible in its full glory. The movements of the planets were easily tracked by naked eye. The cycles of the moon were obvious and unavoidable. The peoples who lived in this landscape before the cities were embedded in the rhythms of the sky in a way that almost no city-dwelling person is today. The sky was a clock, a calendar, a navigation system, a source of stories and meaning. The rising and setting of particular stars marked the beginning and end of seasons, the appropriate times for particular activities, the anniversaries of particular events. The phases of the moon organized the shorter cycles of life. Indigenous astronomical knowledge across North America was sophisticated. The medicine wheels of the northern plains, as we have noted, show astronomical alignments. The Haudenosaunee calendar was based on the movements of specific star clusters, particularly the Pleiades, whose rising at dusk marked the beginning of the planting season and whose heliacal rising marked the new year. The Mi'kmaq had a sophisticated understanding of the night sky and used it for navigation both on land and at sea. This astronomical knowledge was embedded in stories. The stories encoded the knowledge in memorable narrative form, making it easier to transmit across generations without the aid of writing. When you know the story of why a particular star cluster looks the way it does, you also know when that cluster rises and sets, and what its position in the sky means for the season and the activities appropriate to that season. These stories, and the astronomical knowledge they encoded, were part of the cultural heritage of the peoples whose territories encompassed the Canadian cities. They were part of what was already there, part of what was lost when the cultural transmission was disrupted by colonialism and residential schools and the whole apparatus of cultural destruction. Some of these stories survive. Some of the astronomical knowledge has been documented by researchers who worked with elders before the knowledge was entirely lost. The recovery and revitalization of this knowledge is part of the broader effort to restore what was taken. But there is something else that is worth noting here. The stories about the sky are also stories about the land. The Mi'kmaq star stories, for example, encode knowledge about the seasonal movements of animal populations, the timing of plant growth, the rhythms of the marine environment. The sky and the land were understood as a single integrated system, and the stories that describe the sky simultaneously describe the land and the knowledge needed to live well in it. This integration of astronomical, ecological, and cultural knowledge in a single body of narrative tradition is one of the most remarkable features of indigenous knowledge systems. It is also one of the things that makes it most difficult to extract and preserve in a fragmentary way. The knowledge holds together as a system. Remove it from the cultural context in which it is embedded. Separate it from the stories and the ceremonies and the community practices that give it meaning and make it transmissible, and it loses much of what makes it valuable. The cities did not just build over the physical evidence of the pre-contact world. They built over the cultural conditions that made that world's knowledge systems viable. The electric lights that blot out the stars are a metaphor for the broader cultural transformation that made the indigenous relationship with the sky, and the ecological knowledge embedded in the sky stories, invisible and inaccessible to the dominant culture. Now, let's consider a different angle on the whole question we have been investigating. We have been asking what was already there when the Canadian cities were built. We've been looking at the archaeological evidence, the historical record, the cultural traditions of the indigenous peoples whose territories became those cities. We have been building a picture of what existed before. But there is another question hiding inside the original question. Not just what was there, but what was the relationship between what was there and what was built on top of it. The relationship was not simply one of succession, one civilization following another in the same place. It was a relationship of active destruction. The cities were not simply built on top of the pre-contact world. In many cases, they were built through the active elimination of what was there, through the killing and displacement of the peoples who lived there, through the suppression of the cultural traditions that would have preserved the memory of what existed, through the physical destruction of the archaeological evidence that told the story. This distinction matters enormously. If a pre-contact civilization simply ended over time and a new one grew up in its place, the story would be different. We would still have the question of what was there before, but it would be a question about sequence rather than about justice. But that is not what happened. The peoples who lived in the territories of the Canadian cities did not simply make way for new arrivals. They were killed. They were forcibly removed. Their children were taken from them. Their languages were suppressed. Their ceremonies were outlawed. Their lands were taken without adequate compensation or, in many cases, without any compensation at all. They were excluded from the political processes that determined the future of the territories their ancestors had occupied for thousands of years. This was not an accident. It was not an unfortunate side effect of contact between different civilizations. It was a policy, sustained and deliberate, aimed at replacing the pre-contact world with a colonial one, at clearing the landscape of the people who had lived there and filling it with different people who would accept the authority of the colonial state and participate in the colonial economy. The cities are not just built on top of something that was there. They are built on top of something that was deliberately destroyed to make room for them. This is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with. The part that turns the archaeological curiosity about what was there before into a moral reckoning about what was done and what is owed. The cities exist. They will not be dismantled. The question is not whether to unbuild the cities. The question is how to build an honest relationship between the cities and the histories that lie beneath them, between the populations that live in those cities today and the peoples whose territories those cities occupy, between the future that Canadians are building and the past that was destroyed to make it possible. This is the question that the ground beneath the Canadian cities is always asking. It is the question that every new archaeological discovery reopens. It is the question that has no comfortable or easy answer, but it is the question that honesty requires us to keep asking. Here is something that rarely makes it into discussions of Canadian urban history. The question of what the cities are doing to the landscape right now, in the present, and what that means for the future. Cities are not just built over pre-contact landscapes. They are ongoing interventions in those landscapes, continuously transforming them, continuously extracting from them, continuously generating consequences that will be visible in the archaeological and geological record thousands of years from now. The great excavation of basements and foundations and transit tunnels that underlies every urban expansion project is also a destruction of archaeological context. Every time a new building goes up in the core of an established Canadian city, some piece of the pre-contact, or the early colonial, or the 19th century record is disturbed or destroyed. Some is documented before destruction. Much is not. The soil under a city tells its history in layers. The deeper you go, the older the materials. A city with several centuries of European history and thousands of years of indigenous history beneath it has a stratigraphic record of considerable complexity and richness. Every new construction project that goes deeper than previous disturbance potentially encounters new material from older periods. Urban archaeologists in Canada are in a race against development. They are trying to document what exists before it is destroyed, knowing that they will lose most of the race, that most of what exists will be destroyed without ever being adequately documented. The legal and regulatory frameworks that are supposed to protect archaeological sites from destruction are imperfect and inconsistently enforced. The economic pressures that drive development are powerful. The political will to prioritize archaeological preservation over development is limited. This is the present dimension of the story of what was already there. The ongoing destruction of the physical evidence of the pre-contact world continues in every Canadian city, every day, as the cities continue to grow and change. The window for recovering what can still be recovered is not just narrowing for distant or rural sites. It is narrowing in the heart of the cities themselves. There is also an ecological dimension to this ongoing transformation. The cities are not just changing the historical record, they are changing the land itself, the soil and the water and the air and the plant and animal communities. They are generating heat islands that alter local climate patterns. They are introducing pollutants into the soil and the water. They are replacing living ecological systems with sealed surfaces. The landscapes that the pre-contact peoples managed sustainably for thousands of years are being transformed, in the space of a few generations, into something that future archaeologists will find very interesting and very troubling. There is a concept in archaeology called resilience, borrowed from ecology, which refers to the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and maintain its fundamental structure and function. Some systems are highly resilient. They can be severely disturbed and still recover their basic character. Others are fragile. A small perturbation can push them past a tipping point into a fundamentally different configuration. The pre-contact landscapes of Canada were, in some respects, remarkably resilient. They had absorbed and recovered from disturbances that ranged from individual events like the White River volcanic eruption to the gradual reorganization of the landscape as the glaciers retreated. They had been modified by human management for thousands of years without losing their fundamental productivity. They had supported large and dense human populations at certain times and places without the kind of permanent ecological degradation that characterizes industrial exploitation of landscapes. This resilience was not simply a property of the natural systems. It was also a property of the management practices that Indigenous peoples applied to those systems. The resilience was maintained in part by the restraint and knowledge that went into managing the landscape sustainably across long time spans. The colonial transformation of the Canadian landscape has pushed those systems, in many cases, past their resilience thresholds. Soil systems that accumulated over thousands of years have been altered by agricultural chemicals in a few decades. Water systems that ran clean for millennia have been polluted within a generation. Forests that took centuries to develop their complex structure have been clear-cut and replaced with monocultures. These changes are not just ecological problems. They are also losses of the complex systems within which the pre-contact knowledge was embedded. The knowledge of which plants grow where and what they indicate about the soil beneath them, the knowledge of how fish populations behave in specific river systems, the knowledge of how animal populations respond to specific management practices. All of this knowledge is dependent on the existence of the systems it describes. When the systems are transformed beyond recognition, the knowledge loses its immediate application. The recovery of Indigenous knowledge, then, is not just a matter of documenting what elders remember. It is also a matter of recovering the living systems within which that knowledge makes sense. This is why Indigenous land management practices, which seek to restore the ecological conditions of the pre-contact landscape, are not just culturally important but ecologically important as well. Here, near the end of this long journey through the layers of what was already there, let me offer something that is not usually part of discussions of pre-contact history, but that seems important: wonder. The story we have been telling is a story of loss, of destruction, of erased civilizations and suppressed cultures and stolen territories. That is true, and it needs to be said, and it needs to be reckoned with. But there is another way to hold this story, alongside the moral reckoning, not instead of it. There is a way to hold it with wonder. Wonder at the sheer fact of 15,000, 20,000, perhaps more years of human life in this landscape. The children who played by the rivers, the hunters who tracked the bison across the plains, the artists who pressed their hands against the rock and blew pigment around them, leaving their signature in stone, the fishermen who learned the patterns of the salmon run so thoroughly that they could maintain those runs productively for thousands of years, the farmers who cultivated the corn and the squash and the beans of the Three Sisters in the fertile valleys of Ontario, the navigators who sailed the Pacific and found every habitable island in its vast expanse, the astronomers who tracked the stars and encoded their knowledge in stone circles and stories. These were people, real people, with all the complexity and intelligence and creativity and desire that the word implies. They lived full lives in this landscape. They loved each other and argued with each other and told stories about each other and celebrated each other's achievements and mourned each other's deaths. They thought about the big questions about meaning and death and the nature of the world. They made beautiful things because beauty mattered to them, and the places they lived, the places where the cities now stand, were home to them in the deepest sense of that word. Home is the place you know so well that your body moves through it without thought, where the features of the landscape are as familiar as the faces of family members, where your history and your community's history are written into every hill and river and tree. The territories of the pre-contact peoples were home to them in that sense, home built up over generations and centuries and millennia. To stand in a Canadian city and know this, to look at the streets and the buildings and the river running through the urban landscape and know that this place was home to people for thousands of years before any of this was here, is not only a cause for grief, it is also a cause for wonder, for the extraordinary depth of the human relationship with this particular piece of the world. The ground carries that depth, the rivers carry it, the sky above the cities, the same sky that the first inhabitants of these landscapes looked up at when they arrived after the glaciers retreated, the same stars that the Mi'kmaq and the Haudenosaunee and the Blackfoot and the Coast Salish and the Dene and all the other peoples of this continent encoded in their stories and their ceremonies and their understanding of the world. That sky is still there, polluted with light now, obscured by the glow of the cities, but still there, still carrying the same patterns that people have been reading in it for thousands of years. The depth is not gone. It is buried, partly, suppressed, partly, but not gone. The question is whether we can learn to see it, whether we can develop the capacity to stand in a Canadian city and perceive the layers beneath the surface, the time that has accumulated in this landscape, the lives that were lived here before, the civilization that was already remarkable before the European ships ever appeared on the horizon. This is not simply an academic or historical exercise. It is a moral and imaginative one. It requires us to expand our sense of what matters, to include in our understanding of where we live not just what we can see with our own eyes, but what we know is there, below and around and behind the city that we inhabit. It requires us to develop what might be called deep sight, the ability to see through time as well as across space. The ability to recognize, standing on a sidewalk in downtown Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, that we are standing in a place that has been inhabited by human beings for thousands of years, and that those human beings were not simply predecessors or precursors, but people, in the fullest sense, people whose lives and knowledge and beauty and suffering are part of the complete story of the place we inhabit. Developing that capacity is not easy. The cities are designed to obscure what is beneath them. The founding narratives are designed to begin with the Europeans. The cultural habits of selective memory and simplification are powerful, but the evidence keeps surfacing. The artifacts keep being found. The elders keep sharing their knowledge. The indigenous communities keep asserting their presence and their rights and their connection to these places. The archaeologists keep doing their work. The historians keep revising the record. The ground keeps speaking. And if we are paying attention, if we are willing to listen, we can begin to hear what it is saying. Every major Canadian city was built on top of something that was already there. What was already there was extraordinary, and the work of understanding it, acknowledging it, honouring it, learning from it, reckoning with what was done to it, that work is not finished. It is, in the most important sense, only just beginning. There is one more thread in this story that we have not fully followed, a thread that connects the most ancient layers of the pre-contact world to the most contemporary questions about what it means to live in a Canadian city today. The thread is water. Not just water as a resource, not just water as a transportation route, not just water as the ecological foundation of the salmon cultures and the fishing economies of the coast and the interior. Water in a deeper sense. Water as the substance through which the relationship between human beings and the land is mediated, through which the health and the history of a place are most directly readable. Every major Canadian city has a troubled relationship with its water. Toronto has repeatedly been embarrassed by the state of Lake Ontario, by the sewage overflows that contaminate the beaches, by the warming temperatures that are changing the lake's ecology, by the toxic sediments that lie at the bottom of the harbour. Montreal has struggled with the quality of the St. Lawrence, which receives enormous quantities of pharmaceutical runoff and industrial pollutants along its long course through the interior of the continent. Vancouver has seen the Fraser River's salmon runs decline dramatically over the past century. Ottawa draws its drinking water from the Ottawa River, which carries the agricultural runoff and the treated sewage of the valley through which it runs. The water is telling us something. The same water that was clean and productive and teeming with life for thousands of years before the cities arrived is now struggling. Not everywhere, not entirely. The water is still here. The rivers are still running. The lakes are still full. But they are different from what they were. They are diminished in ways that are measurable and significant. The pre-contact peoples understood that the health of the water was inseparable from the health of everything else. Their management practices, their protocols around fishing and gathering and travel and settlement were organized around maintaining the productivity of the water systems that supported their lives. When those management practices were disrupted, when the people who understood the water were removed from the landscape, the water began to change. This is not to say that indigenous management of the water was perfect, or that the return to pre-contact conditions is possible or even desirable. The world is different. The climate is changing. The populations that use the water are enormous by pre-contact standards. The industrial and agricultural systems that generate the pollutants are deeply embedded in the economy. But the knowledge that sustained the water systems for thousands of years is still partly available. Indigenous water knowledge, the knowledge of how rivers behave and what their behavior indicates about the health of the watershed, is not entirely gone. It is being documented and revitalized by indigenous communities across the country. It is beginning to be incorporated, however imperfectly, into the water management frameworks of government agencies. The water connects the pre-contact world to the present in a way that nothing else quite does. You cannot look at a dirty river without wondering what it looked like before. You cannot see a salmon struggling to reach its spawning ground past a dam or through a polluted tributary without thinking about the 10,000 years during which those fish ran free and the peoples who depended on them maintained the conditions that made that possible. The water is a living record of what was there before, and a living indicator of what has been lost, and a living argument for recovering the knowledge that could help restore it. There are stories buried in the water too, not just evidence of the past, but actual stories, oral traditions and ceremonial knowledge that are encoded in the rivers and lakes and coastlines of Canada. The Mi'kmaq have stories about the Bay of Fundy and its extraordinary tides. The stories explain the tides in terms of the activities of supernatural beings, but they also encode accurate observations of tidal patterns and their ecological consequences. The Mi'kmaq knowledge of the Bay of Fundy was sophisticated enough to support a productive fishing economy on its shores for thousands of years. The Anishinaabe have stories about the Great Lakes that encode knowledge of the lake's hydrology, their seasonal patterns, their ecological systems. The stories about Mishizigwe, the great underground creature whose movements create the storms on Lake Superior, are simultaneously mythological and meteorological, encoding observations about the specific weather patterns of that enormous lake. The Cree have stories about the rivers and lakes of the boreal forest that encode knowledge of the seasonal rhythms of those systems, the patterns of fish and animal movement, the signs that indicate changing conditions. This knowledge was essential for survival in an environment that required precise timing and accurate prediction of where resources would be available and when. All of these stories are also, in a literal sense, geographical knowledge. They map the landscape, identify significant features, describe the behavior of ecological systems, warn of hazards, and mark the locations of resources. They were the navigational and ecological databases of the pre-contact world, maintained and transmitted in narrative form. Some of these stories are still told. Some of the geographical and ecological knowledge they encode is still held by elders and knowledge keepers. But the tradition of transmission has been broken or damaged in many cases by the residential school system, by the disruption of community life, by the death of fluent elders before they could pass on what they knew. The rivers about which these stories were told are still there. They are running through the backyards of Canadian cities, or beneath their streets in buried channels, or past the edges of the urban landscape where the city gives way to the suburban fringe, and eventually to the rural and the wild. The rivers are still there, waiting for the stories that describe them to be fully recovered and told again. Let's step back for a moment and take in the full scale of what we have been discussing. We have been talking about a civilization that extended across the entire territory of what is now Canada. A civilization that was not a single culture or a single political entity, but a mosaic of hundreds of distinct nations, languages, and cultural traditions, connected by trade networks and diplomatic relationships and shared recognition of territorial boundaries across the enormous geographic diversity of the continent. This civilization was not static. Over thousands of years it changed, developed, grew more complex in some places, and simplified in others in response to changing environmental conditions, the development of new technologies, the expansion and contraction of populations, and the complex political dynamics of trade, alliance, and conflict among neighboring nations. At its peak, in the centuries immediately before European contact, some parts of this civilization were achieving remarkable things. The large towns of the Street, Lawrence Valley, of which Hochelaga was one example and Stadacona another, were sophisticated settlements supporting populations in the thousands. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the League of Five Nations, was a political organization of considerable sophistication, whose system of governance by consensus, whose mechanisms for peacemaking and conflict resolution have been argued by some historians to have influenced the development of democratic political theory in the European Enlightenment. The maritime cultures of the Pacific coast were producing art of extraordinary quality and complexity, building large and elaborate structures, maintaining political organizations that could manage the resources of enormous coastal territories. The agricultural cultures of the Great Lakes region were feeding large populations with the Three Sisters crops and trading the surplus across long distances. And simultaneously, in the far north, in the Arctic and subarctic, the ancestors of the Inuit and the various Dene nations were developing and maintaining some of the most sophisticated cold-weather survival technologies ever devised, enabling human communities to live productively in environments that would kill an unprepared person within hours. This was a civilization, not one civilization but many, related and interacting and co-evolving across thousands of years and millions of square kilometers, a civilization of enormous diversity and depth, whose achievements in ecology, in art, in political organization, in knowledge management, and in the sustainable use of natural systems over very long time spans represent some of the most remarkable accomplishments in human history. This is what the Canadian cities were built on top of. This is what was already there. And if you are lying somewhere quiet as this voice comes to you through the night, if you are in a bed in one of these cities, or in a house in the suburbs of one of these cities, or in an apartment somewhere in the vast urban landscape of Canada, know this. Beneath you, the layers go down. Beneath the concrete and the pipes and the cables, beneath the fill and the construction debris and the disturbed soil of 2 centuries of urban development, beneath all of that, the earth holds its memory. The charcoal from fires that burned thousands of years ago is in that earth. The bones of people who lived their whole lives within walking distance of where you are, people who were born and grew and loved and died in this specific landscape, are in that earth. The artifacts of their daily lives, the tools they made, and the pots they cooked in, and the objects they made beautiful, because beauty mattered to them, those things are in that earth. The seeds of plants they cultivated are in that earth, dormant and waiting. The mycorrhizal networks that connected the roots of the forest trees for thousands of years before the forest was cleared are in that earth, reduced but not entirely destroyed, still doing their slow work of connection and communication. The water that falls on the city tonight is the same water that fell on this landscape 10,000 years ago and was drunk by people who had no idea what a city was, who looked at the sky above them with the same wonder that the sky always inspires, who fell asleep in their own way under the same stars. Everything that was already there is not entirely gone. Some of it was destroyed, much of it was damaged. The people who built it were displaced and diminished, and in some cases nearly destroyed. The knowledge they had accumulated over thousands of years was suppressed and attacked and in many cases lost. The landscape they had managed sustainably was transformed in ways that may never be fully repaired. But it is not entirely gone. The rivers are still running. The stars are still in the same positions they were in when the first people looked at them from this landscape. The descendants of the peoples who lived here before the cities are still here, still carrying in their bodies and their memories and their cultural practices the connection to this land that goes back thousands of years. And the ground is still speaking. This is what the ground is saying. This is what was already there, and it was already extraordinary. We started this journey with a question. A deceptively simple question that turned out, as the best questions do, to open into something vast and complicated and beautiful and dark all at once. Every major Canadian city was built on top of something that was already there. We have followed that question through the archaeology of the Forks in Winnipeg, 6,000 years old, through the mystery of Hochelaga, the great city of the street, Lawrence that vanished before Europeans could fully understand it, through the 10,000 years of Musqueam presence in what is now Vancouver, through the ancient trade routes that became the foundations of Edmonton and Ottawa and every city in between, through the medicine wheels on the northern plains and the petroglyphs in Ontario and the sacred heights above the Ottawa River, through the languages that carried the names of the rivers and the mountains and the confluences where the cities were built, through the knowledge of water and fire and sky and plant and animal that sustained human communities in this landscape for longer than civilization has existed anywhere on Earth. We have asked what was there, and the answer has been so much. More than we usually allow ourselves to know. More than the simplified founding narratives of the Canadian cities want to acknowledge. More than the textbooks taught. More than the monuments celebrate. More than the city planning documents recognize. But acknowledging it is not enough. The ground does not simply want to be seen. It wants to be known, in the full sense of that word. Known as a place with history and meaning and the accumulated weight of human presence across thousands of years. Known as the home of peoples who are still here, still carrying that history in their bodies and their cultures, still asserting their presence and their rights in the cities that were built on their territories. The cities are still becoming. They are not finished. They are still being made, still being argued over, still being imagined in new ways. The story of what they are and what they owe and what they might become is still open, and the ground beneath them is still speaking, still offering its testimony, still insisting that the full story has not yet been told, that the deepest layers have not yet been fully read, that what was already there deserves to be not just acknowledged but honoured, not just documented but learned from, not just known but felt. The rivers are still running, the stars are still there, the memory is in the ground, and we are still, all of us, living in the middle of a story that began long before us and will continue long after. The layers go down. They always do, and the story is never finished. It is only paused. What we have learned, across all of this, across all the cities and all the layers and all the evidence, is that the depth beneath us is real. It is not invented. It is not sentimentalized. It is documented. It is physical. It is there in the soil whenever anyone takes the time to look. The depth is the story, and the story is ours to tell honestly, for the first time, finally, together.